Before the crossroads existed, there was the world before choosing. It is difficult to imagine this now. From inside a world that is built entirely from choices, from the accumulated decisions of gods and mortals and the deep impersonal forces that move through everything like weather, each one selecting one path from all the possible paths, and making that selection into what we call history, what we call reality, what we call the way things are. But there was a time before the crossroads, a time when the roads had not yet been laid down, when the world was still in the process of deciding what shape it was going to take. And in that time, the particular kind of knowledge that the crossroads requires, the knowledge of edges, of the places where one thing ends and another begins, of the threshold that is neither here nor there but both, did not yet have a home. It would find one. The world in those early ages was the world of the Titans, and the world of the Titans had a quality that the later Olympian world would partly lose. The quality of enormity, of scale, of things existing at a size and a depth that made the human measure of them difficult and in some ways impossible. The Titans were not simply large. They were large in the way that weather is large, in the way that geology is large, in the way that forces which have been operating since before anything was keeping track of them are large. Their size was not a physical dimension but a quality of presence, a weight in the world that made itself felt not by any specific action but simply by being what they were. Among them were two who would matter for this story. Perseus was the Titan of destruction, not destruction in the simple sense of the word, not the brute and heedless breaking of things that the word sometimes implies. Destruction in its deeper and more honest sense, the sense in which destruction is the necessary complement of creation, the force that clears away what has accumulated beyond its usefulness, that makes the space in which new things can form. A forest fire is destruction. It is also the condition for the next forest. Perseus understood this, carried it in his nature, moved through the world with the particular quality of something that knows how to end things in order to allow beginnings. Asteria was the goddess of falling stars. She carried in her the quality of light that crosses the dark, not the steady light of the sun or the reliable light of the fixed stars, but the light of the falling one, the brief and brilliant trajectory through the dark that leaves behind it a line in the memory of anyone who saw it, a line that is not quite light anymore, but is the trace of light, the record of a passage. She had fled Zeus's pursuit by transforming herself into a quail and throwing herself into the sea, and the island of Delos had risen from where she fell, an island that would later become the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, that would carry in its stone the memory of her falling. From Perseus and Asteria, Hecate came. She came the way the night comes, gradually, without announcement, the world not noticing the exact moment of her arrival, noticing only that at some point between before and after she was here, completely and without remainder, present in the way that things are present when their presence is not a performance but a fact. The sky above the place of her birth was dark, which is to say it was full of the particular richness that the night sky carries when the moon is absent and the stars are unobstructed, each one present in its own light, the whole of them together making the darkness into something that was the opposite of empty. She was born with three faces, not as a deformity, not as something remarkable even in the world of divine births, which had already produced creatures of extraordinary form without apology or explanation. The three faces were simply her. as natural to her as the single face is natural to a being whose nature requires only one direction of sight. She looked in three directions at once, and the three directions were not merely left and right and forward, but something more fundamental than spatial orientation. They were the three directions of existence itself, the past and the present and the future, the was and the is and the will be, held in the same head, attended to with the same quality of awareness, given equal weight in the same consciousness. She opened her eyes for the first time, and saw everything at once. For a mortal, such an experience would be overwhelming. The past pressing in from one side and the future from another, and the present somewhere in the middle, all of it arriving simultaneously, none of it filtered or sequenced or given the comfortable narrative shape that mortal consciousness imposes on experience to make it bearable. For Hecate, it was simply what seeing was. She had no prior experience of seeing in only one direction, no memory of a time when the world arrived in sequence, no understanding that for most conscious beings, the three directions of time were experienced one at a time in the order of their occurrence. She saw them all, and they were simply the world. Her mother Asteria held her in the dark after the birth, and the falling star quality of Asteria's presence moved through the infant goddess the way starlight moves through the night, not warming it exactly, not changing it in any dramatic way, but illuminating it in the particular way of starlight, which shows you the shapes of things without revealing their colors, which makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar, which is the quality of light most suited to a consciousness that was going to spend its existence in the space between the known and the unknown. Her father Perseus stood at the edge of where she was born, and felt in his daughter the quality that was his own, but changed, refined, expressed in a different mode. His destruction was elemental, geological. The destruction of fire and time and the deep impersonal forces that reshape the world. Her destruction was more surgical, more precise. The destruction of the threshold, the ending that happened at the exact boundary between one state and another. The cut so clean that the ending was also a beginning, and the two could not be separated. She was both her parents and neither of them. She was something the world had not had before. In those first days she moved through the world at the edges of things, not at the center of the forest, but at the edge where the trees thinned and the meadow began. In the particular light of that boundary where the shadows of the tree line reached across the open ground, and the open ground's light reached back into the trees, and neither condition was fully present. Not at the center of the sea, but at the shore, where the water and the land negotiated their endless boundary. Not at the top of the mountain, and not at the base, but somewhere in the middle, where the rock changed character, where one type of stone gave way to another. She was most herself at the edges. The edges were where the interesting things happened, where one thing ended and another began. There was always a particular quality of life, a density of the unusual that did not exist in the centers of things. The shore was richer in strange creatures than either the sea or the land. The forest edge supported more kinds of life than either the deep forest or the open meadow. The threshold was always more interesting than what lay on either side of it. And Hecate understood this with the complete and instinctive understanding of someone who did not learn it as a principle, but was born already knowing it as a fact of her own experience. She learned the herbs. The plants that grew at the edges were different from the plants that grew at the centers, not always visibly different. Some of them looked unremarkable, small and ordinary, the kind of plant that a person walking along a road would step over without attention. But they had properties that the center plants did not have. They had learned from living at the boundary, from being neither entirely in the sun nor entirely in the shade, neither entirely in the wet nor entirely in the dry, how to hold contradictions in their chemistry, the way Hecate held contradictions in her triple sight. They could heal and harm, they could open and close, they could move a person toward sleep or away from it, could make the boundary between waking and dreaming more permeable or more solid. She carried them with her. She carried them the way she carried everything, not as possessions exactly, not as things owned and stored and kept. She carried them as extensions of her knowledge, as the physical expression of the understanding she had gathered at the edges of things. As tools for the work that she was beginning to understand was her work, which was the work of the threshold, the tending of the places between, the attending to the needs of those who found themselves at the crossroads of their lives and did not know which road to take. But the crossroads did not exist yet. Roads had not yet been laid in any formal way. The world moved along paths that were paths only because feet had walked them, because animals had moved in their seasonal migrations and worn the ground down in lines that other feet then followed, because water had run in the same channels season after season and made the ground beside those channels easier to walk than the ground elsewhere. The world was a place of paths rather than roads, of worn ways rather than built ones. And yet she could feel, moving through the world in her early existence, the places where paths met, the places where three ways converged in the same point, where travelers coming from different directions would arrive at the same small piece of ground and pause before choosing which of the ways ahead to take. These places were not marked. They were not acknowledged by any sign or any name. They were simply the places where choice made itself most visible in the landscape, where the fact that the world offered more than one direction was made concrete in the geometry of the ground. She stopped at each of them. She stood in the middle of each meeting of ways and felt the quality of that place, which was different from the quality of the paths themselves, in the same way that the edges of things were different from the things themselves. The meeting of ways was a place of potential, not of one thing or another thing, but of all things simultaneously. The roads not yet taken still present as possibilities, the choice not yet made still hovering in the air above the intersection like something that had not yet decided to become real. This was where she was most completely herself, not the edge of the forest or the shore of the sea or the middle of the mountain, though all of those had something of what the crossroads had. The crossroads had it most fully, most purely, most completely. The quality of the between, the quality of the threshold, the quality of a place that was genuinely and entirely neither here nor there, but the place where here and there came together and made something that was more than either. She stood at a crossing of three paths in the early world, not a road, not yet, just three worn ways through long grass meeting at a small bare patch of earth where the feet of many creatures over many seasons had pressed the ground down to stone, and she felt the place recognize her. It was not a dramatic recognition. It was quiet in the way that the most important recognitions are quiet. Not a clap of thunder or a sudden light, but the small and complete settling of something that has been slightly wrong becoming right. The crossroads felt her standing in it, and she felt the crossroads beneath her feet, and between them, in the exchange of that mutual feeling, something was established that would last for as long as the world lasted. This was hers. not in the way that the sea was Poseidon's or the sky was Zeus's, not as a domain to rule and command and shape according to her will, in a different way, in the way that a home is yours, not because you built it or own it in any legal sense, but because you fit it and it fits you, and the fitting is so complete and so mutual that the distinction between the place and the person who belongs in it becomes, in the quiet moments, a distinction without a difference. She stood at the crossroads in the early world, and the night came down around her in its gradual and complete way, and the stars came out above her in their thousands, carrying in their light the quality of her mother Asteria's nature, and the ground beneath her feet carried in its cold and patient stone the quality of her father Perseus's nature. And she stood between those two inheritances at the place where all roads met, and held her torches, which had come to her hands the way everything came to her, not dramatically, not as a gift from an external source, but as the natural expression of what she was, fire that she carried because she was the illumination of the dark places, the light at the threshold, the torch that burned at the crossroads between everything and everything else. The night deepened around her. The path stretched away in three directions into the dark, and somewhere in the distance, so faint it was almost not sound at all, the first dogs began to howl. The dogs howled in the far dark, and the torches burned at the crossroads, and the night deepened around Hecate in its slow and complete way, and the three paths stretched away into the world in their three directions, and she stood at the center of them, and felt the quality of what she was and where she was, and understood in the wordless way that gods understand things that are too large for words, that this was only the beginning. The world changed. It changed in the way that the world changes when something very large and very old gives way to something very large and very new. Not all at once, not cleanly, not with any single moment that could be pointed to as the pivot. It changed in the way of geological things, in the way of tectonic forces pressing against each other for a very long time, until the accumulated pressure finds its release in a movement that reshapes the landscape entirely. The Titans had been the world's first great powers. They had been enormous and elemental, and had moved through the young world with the uncomplicated authority of things that have never been challenged, that have been what they are since before the concept of challenge existed. Then the challenge came. She felt the titanomachy from the edges. This was where she received everything. From the edges, from the boundary places, from the threshold between the event and the observer of the event. She did not fight in the war the way some of the Titans fought, with the direct and elemental force of divine power applied against divine power. She moved through its margins, through the spaces between the great collisions, through the places where the war was not yet and the places where it had already passed. She felt it as a quality of the world rather than as a series of events. The way the ground vibrated differently, the way the night air carried a new sharpness, the way the crossroads she stood at seemed to pulse with a potential that the old world had not had. She attended to her work. Her work in those years was what it had always been. The tending of the threshold places, the standing at the crossroads, the carrying of her torches through the dark to illuminate the paths that travelers needed to see. The war was enormous, and she was not enormous in that way. She was not a force that could shake mountains or split the sea. Her power was of a different kind entirely. The power of the precise and the liminal. The power of the space between rather than the power of the thing itself. And the war had no particular need for that kind of power. She waited, not passively. She was never passive, even in her waiting, because her waiting was the waiting of full attention rather than the waiting of absence, the waiting of someone who is completely present to what is happening around them and is available to it without being swept away by it. She stood at her crossroads and felt the war moving through the world like weather moving through a landscape. Tremendous, reshaping, producing in its wake a world that would be different from the world that had preceded it, in ways that would take a very long time to fully understand. Then it ended. The Titans fell, and Zeus stood at the center of the new order with his thunder in his hand and the sky above him, and the world arranged itself around the fact of his authority the way a landscape arranges itself around a mountain, not because the mountain commanded it, but because the mountain was there and was what it was, and everything else found its position in relation to that immovable fact. Zeus was the new center of things, and the world organized itself accordingly. And then something unexpected happened. Zeus honored Hecate, not diminished her, not cast her down, not absorbed her into the new Olympian order in the way that some of the older powers were absorbed. Their natures reduced to attributes of the newer gods, their independence dissolved into the general brightness of the Olympian world. He honored her, specifically, individually, with a recognition that was different in quality from the recognition he gave to the gods of his own generation, not the recognition of a ruler acknowledging his counsel, but something more like the recognition of a very powerful thing acknowledging a very old thing, the acknowledgement that some forms of authority predate the current order, and are not subject to it in the way that newer things are subject to it. He gave her dominion over earth and sea and sky, the three realms that he and his brothers had divided between themselves, the sky that was his, the sea that was Poseidon's, the broad earth that was held in common. All three were also hers, in her own way and on her own terms, not in competition with any of the three brothers, not as a rival claim to the same territory, but as the freedom to move through all three, to exercise her particular gifts in all three, to extend the quality of her presence, the threshold quality, the liminal quality, the quality of the edge and the crossroads and the between, across the full extent of the world without boundary or restriction. She stood at the edge of the sea, and felt the permission move through her like a tide. The permission was not power in the ordinary sense of the word. It was not an increase in her capacity to do things, not a new set of abilities added to what she already had. She had always moved through the world without asking permission, had always stood at her crossroads and carried her torches and tended the threshold places with the complete authority of a being whose nature was the authority for what she did, not granted by anyone, not derived from any source outside herself, simply the expression of what she was in the place she was made for. What Zeus gave her was something more subtle than power. It was acknowledgement. It was the formal recognition by the new order of things that she was what she was, that her nature and her work were real and necessary, and would continue to be real and necessary in the world that was being made, that the Olympian age would not replace the threshold or abolish the crossroads or make obsolete the particular kind of knowledge that lived at the edges of things. He acknowledged that the between places existed and would always exist, that the edges of the world were as real as its centers, that the night was as necessary as the day and the dark moon as necessary as the full one. This mattered, not because she had needed his permission to be what she was. She had been what she was since before he existed, but because the acknowledgement of a new and very powerful order, that her way of being in the world was valid, was necessary, was not going to be subsumed into the bright new regime of Olympus, had a quality that permission alone would never have had. It was the acknowledgement of the old by the new, the recognition by the daylight world that the threshold world was not its enemy or its shadow, but its complement, as necessary to the whole as the daylight itself. She received it with the gravity it deserved, not with gratitude exactly. Gratitude implied a debt, implied that what she had received was a gift from an external source rather than the recognition of something already true. With gravity, with the seriousness of someone who understands that what has just been established is important, and will be important for as long as the world lasts, that the formal acknowledgement of the threshold by the center is not a small thing but a very large one, that it shapes what the world will be in ways that will not always be visible but will always be real. She moved through her 3 realms in those early years of the new order, learning what it meant to have them all. She had always known the earth. The earth was her first element, the ground beneath the crossroads, the soil at the edge of the field where the herbs grew, the stone of the threshold that was neither inside nor outside but both. She knew the earth in the way of something that had been formed by it, that had its roots in the particular quality of ground that existed at the margins, that had learned its first knowledge from the plants that grew where the earth was neither entirely cultivated nor entirely wild. She went to the sea. She had been to the shore before, had stood at the edge of the water in the way she stood at all edges, attending to the quality of the threshold between the water and the land. But now she went further, went into the sea itself, descended through the surface water and the middle depths and into the cold and dark of the deep in the way that only a being given explicit dominion over the sea could go. And she felt what Poseidon felt in the deep, the pressure and the cold and the extraordinary and complex life of a world that existed entirely outside the awareness of the surface. She felt the threshold of the sea from the inside, felt the places where the ocean floor met the abyssal plain, where the cold current met the warm, where the light water met the dark. Everything had edges. Even the sea, which presented itself as continuous, had within it the constant presence of the threshold, the meeting of waters, the boundary between temperatures, the invisible line where one current gave way to another. She was at home everywhere. There were edges. She went to the sky. This was the strangest of the 3 for her, because the sky was her uncle Hyperion's old country, was the domain of light and warmth, and the steady, reliable movement of the celestial bodies, everything that was the opposite of the threshold, the opposite of the edge, the quality of permanence and predictability that was as foreign to her nature as anything she knew. She moved through the sky in the way she moved through everything, from the edges, from the places where the sky met the earth at the horizon, where the blue faded into the gray of far distance, where the atmosphere thinned into the quality of nothing that lay beyond it. And she found even there, in the sky that was the home of the steady and the reliable, the edges that were hers, the horizon, the place where the sky became the earth and the earth became the sky, the line that was not a line but a relationship, the boundary that moved as you moved toward it, that could never be reached because it was not a place but the expression of a distance. She stood at the horizon in the sky's sense and felt it as the crossroads felt, the meeting of 2 things in a place that was neither of them, the threshold that was more real than what it separated. Then there were the mortals. The mortals had always been at the crossroads. This was what she understood more fully as the new order established itself, and the mortal world grew more complex, grew more populated, grew more fully into the particular human project of building a civilization in the middle of a world that was mostly wilderness. They came to the crossroads because the crossroads was where the question of which way to go became undeniable, where the road that had been one road became three roads and the traveler was required to choose. But they came for other reasons too. They came at the dark of the moon, when the sky was most fully itself, and the stars were most visible, and the quality of the night was deepest. They came with small offerings, food prepared and brought in the dark, herbs wrapped in cloth, small figures made from whatever material their hands found most natural. They left these things at the crossroads without ceremony, without the elaborate ritual of the temple offerings, without priests or incantations or the formal apparatus of divine approach. They left them quietly in the dark and stepped back and went home without looking over their shoulder. This was the right way to honor her, not because she required humility or demanded a specific form of address, but because the crossroads offering was honest in a way that temple ritual sometimes was not. It was the direct expression of a need, the simple acknowledgement that a person was at a crossing in their life and did not know which road to take, and was asking for the illumination of the torches that burned at the place where all roads met. It required nothing except the willingness to come to the threshold in the dark and stand there for a moment and be honest about not knowing. She received these offerings with the same attention she gave to everything, complete, unhurried, entirely present to the particular quality of each one. A woman came to a crossroads on a moonless night carrying bread and a small oil lamp. She set them down at the center of the meeting of ways and knelt for a moment in the dark, not speaking, not asking in words, because the asking was in the being there, in the having come in the dark with her offering, in the kneeling at the place where the roads met. She was at a crossroads in the most personal and painful sense of the word. Her life had arrived at a point where two possible futures diverged from the present, and she could not see clearly enough in the direction of either to know which was the better choice. Hecate stood at the crossroads, and the woman could not see her. This was the way it almost always was. The goddess of the threshold was not a presence that the ordinary eye could see, not a figure that appeared in the way that Apollo might appear to a supplicant in the full brightness of the day, immediately and unmistakably divine. She was present in the way that the threshold was present, not as a thing you could point to, but as a quality of the place, a change in the air, a slight deepening of the dark that was also a slight brightening of the awareness, a feeling of being attended to that had no obvious source. The woman felt it. She felt something shift in the quality of the night around her, something that was not wind and was not sound, but was a presence. The feeling of attention returned, of having sent out into the dark the wordless question of her kneeling and having it received by something that was genuinely there. She breathed in the cool night air and held it for a moment and breathed it out, and in the breathing something settled in her. Some of the tight confusion of the crossroads loosened slightly, not into certainty. Hecate did not give certainty, had never given certainty. Certainty was not what the crossroads offered, but into something more useful than certainty. Clarity. The particular clarity that comes not from being told which road to take, but from being seen clearly enough by something old enough and honest enough that you begin to see yourself clearly too. The clarity that comes from standing at the threshold with full attention given to your actual situation, rather than the situation you wish you were in. The clarity of the crossroads, which illuminates all roads equally, and lets the traveler choose with full sight rather than half sight. The woman rose from her kneeling. She looked down each of the 3 roads in the dark. The torches burned at the center of the crossing. She could not see them, but their light was present in the quality of the night around the intersection. A warmth that was not warmth, an illumination that was not visible but was felt. She made her choice with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has been helped to see what was already true. She walked away down one of the roads. Hecate watched her go. She watched her until the dark of the road took her and she was gone. And then she turned her 3 faces in their 3 directions and felt the world around her in its entirety. The earth beneath the crossroads and the sea at the edge of the land, and the sky above heavy with stars. And she breathed the night air of the world that was now entirely and formally hers to move through, and the torches in her hands burned with the steady light of something that had been burning since before the first road was laid, and would be burning long after the last traveler had made the last choice and gone home in the dark. The dogs moved in the distance. The night deepened. The crossroads waited. The crossroads waited in the dark, and the torches burned with their steady ancient light, and the dogs moved somewhere in the far distance of the night. And Hecate stood at the center of the meeting of ways, and felt the world around her in all its directions at once. And the feeling was not overwhelming, but simply what seeing was. Simply the natural condition of a consciousness that had never known any other way of being in the world. 3 faces. It is worth staying with this for a moment, in the way that this whole story asks you to stay with things, not moving past them toward what comes next, but letting them be fully present, fully themselves, fully understood before the current carries you forward. The 3 faces of Hecate were not a curiosity, not a divine eccentricity, not a symbol invented by later minds to represent something that the goddess did not actually embody. They were her, as fundamental to what she was as the stillness was fundamental to Hades, as the restlessness was fundamental to Poseidon, as the movement was fundamental to Kronos. She had always had them. From the first moment of her existence, from the first opening of her awareness onto the world, she had seen in 3 directions simultaneously. The past was behind her left face, and the future was before her right face, and the present was the center face, and all 3 were attended to with the same quality of attention. None privileged over the others, none more or less real than the others, all 3 part of the same continuous experience of being alive in a world that moved through time. What was it like? This is the question that deserves the most careful attention, the question that is easiest to answer superficially and hardest to answer honestly. The superficial answer is that it was like seeing in 3 directions, useful perhaps, for avoiding threats from behind, for navigating complex terrain, for the simple physical advantages of wider perception. But this answer misses everything that was actually true about it. It treats the 3 faces as a physical feature rather than as a mode of being, as eyes rather than as a way of existing in time. The honest answer requires patience. Imagine knowing with the same clarity and the same immediacy that you know the present moment, what happened an hour ago, not remembering it, Memory is a reconstruction, a reaching back, an imperfect and selective retrieval of something that is no longer directly accessible. Actually knowing it, in the same mode that you know the sensation of your breath moving in and out right now, in the same mode that you know the weight of your body resting where it rests. The past as immediate as the present, not receding, not losing its clarity with distance, simply there, as present as anything else, differently textured than the present moment, but no less real, no less directly felt. Now add the future with the same quality, not the future as prediction, not the future as calculation or forecast, or the projection of present trends into imagined outcomes. The future as direct experience, as something attended to with the same immediacy as the present, as a quality of existence that was part of what being alive felt like. Hecate looked into the future the way you look across a room, not into a fog, not into a probability distribution, but into a place that was real and present and full of the specific texture of what was going to happen, what was in the process of becoming, what had not yet arrived, but was on its way with the same certainty that morning is on its way in the deep of the night. She held all three at once. This is the thing that is most difficult to hold in the mind, and the difficulty is worth sitting with, because the sitting with it produces something. The way sitting with any difficult thing long enough produces something. Not resolution exactly, but a deeper quality of understanding, an appreciation of the actual strangeness of what you are trying to understand rather than the false comfort of a too easy explanation. She held the past and the present and the future simultaneously, not as a sequence she moved through one at a time, but as a space she inhabited all at once, the way a room is inhabited, your body in one place, and your awareness extending in every direction through the full volume of the space. She was never surprised. This was the most immediately practical consequence of the triple sight, and it is worth noting before moving to the deeper consequences. Surprise requires a direction you were not looking, requires the arrival of information from a quarter that your attention had not covered. Hecate had no uncovered quarters. Everything arrived already attended to, already present in her awareness before it became present in the world. The future face of her having looked at it before it crossed the threshold into the present. Nothing came from nowhere. Nothing arrived without having been seen approaching. But she was not forewarned in the way that the word forewarned suggests, with the urgency of warning, with the forward lean of someone bracing for what is coming. She was simply aware of it, already in relationship with it. The event that had not yet happened was already part of her experience, already familiar, already integrated into the same wide awareness that held everything else. When it arrived, it was not new. It was the completion of something she had already known. This changed her relationship with waiting. For most beings, waiting was defined by the gap between what was and what was not yet, the uncomfortable space of not having the thing you were moving toward, the experience of absence that defined the interval between desire and fulfillment. For Hecate, waiting was different in a way that was fundamental. The future was already present to her. The thing she was waiting for was already there in her right face vision, already real, already attended to. The waiting was not the experience of absence, but the experience of presence in two forms simultaneously. The present moment in which the thing had not yet arrived, and the future moment in which it had. It gave her patience of a different quality from the patience of Hades, who was patient because his nature was stillness, and stillness is inherently patient, or the patience of Cronos, who was patient because he was time itself, and time does not experience impatience. Her patience was the patience of someone who has already seen the outcome, and is therefore completely at ease with the process, who knows that the road leads where it leads, and can walk it without urgency because the destination is not uncertain. And then there was the deeper consequence. The deeper consequence was loneliness of a particular and unrepeatable kind. She saw what was coming for everyone, not in the mode of a prophecy oracle, not as isolated visions of specific future events, but as the continuous and complete awareness of the future that her right face maintained as naturally as her left face maintained the awareness of the past. She saw what was coming for the mortals who came to her crossroads and left their offerings in the dark. She saw what was coming for the gods who moved through the world in their bright Olympian way. She saw it all with the same clarity and the same immediacy as she saw the present moment. She could not unsee it. This was not always painful. Often the future she saw was simply the continuation of what was, the ordinary progress of things moving from where they were to where they were going, the seasons turning, the generations passing, the world going on in its faithful way. She saw this, and it was not painful, was simply the fullness of her awareness, the complete picture of time that her nature maintained as naturally as breathing. But sometimes what the right face saw was a sorrow that had not yet arrived, a mortal at the crossroads who would make the wrong choice, not wrong in the sense of morally inferior. Hecate did not organize the world into right choices and wrong choices, into paths that were blessed and paths that were cursed. Wrong in the sense of mismatched, the choice that did not fit the person making it, the road that would lead them to a place that was genuinely not where they needed to go. She saw this, and she saw the person's face in the present moment, full of the ordinary confusion of someone at a crossing who does not know which way to turn. And she held both things, the present confusion and the future consequence, in the same awareness. She could not tell them, not directly, not with the clarity of her own seeing. This was the condition of her nature, the necessary boundary of what she was. She was the illumination of the threshold, not the decision-maker at the threshold. She held her torches so the traveler could see the roads. She could not choose the road for them, could not hand them the knowledge her right face held, as information they could use in the way of a map or a direction. The crossroads offered illumination. The choice remained always and entirely with the one who stood at it. She learned to live with this. She learned it slowly, across the long ages of her existence, the way all the deepest things are learned. Not as information absorbed from an external source, but as the gradual integration of a truth that was uncomfortable and real and could not be avoided. She learned that the seeing and the telling were different things, that having the knowledge of what was coming did not create the obligation or even the ability to prevent what was coming, that her role was not to change the direction of the river, but to illuminate its surface, so that those moving on it could see where they were. The three faces found their peace with each other slowly. In the earliest ages of her existence they had been not quite in conflict, but not quite in harmony either. The past face and the future face each pressing their respective temporal territories into the present face's awareness with an insistence that could be, in the moments of highest intensity, genuinely difficult. The past was always full of what had been, all the accumulated weight of everything that had already happened pressing against the present with the heaviness of the already decided. The future was always full of what was coming, pressing from the other direction with the particular urgency of things that had not yet arrived, but were going to. And the present face was always trying to inhabit the present. She found her equilibrium at the crossroads. This was the place where the triple sight achieved its most natural expression, where the three faces found the arrangement that allowed all three to be fully themselves without crowding out the others. At the crossroads, the past, present, and future were not competing temporalities, but the three roads themselves, the road behind along which you had come, the two roads ahead from which you must choose. The structure of the crossroads was the structure of her consciousness made physical, made geographical, made into something that could be walked and stood in and attended to with the body as well as the mind. When she stood at the crossroads, she was completely at rest, not still. She was never entirely still, was not made for the absolute stillness of a Hades or the geological patience of a Chronos. Her rest was the rest of something that has found the form in which all its qualities can be expressed simultaneously, without friction. The rest of a river in the stretch of its course where the gradient is exactly right, and the current moves with the easy authority of something doing precisely what it was made to do. She raised her torches, one in the left hand and one in the right, and the third face lit without a torch, lit from within, lit by the quality of her awareness itself, which had always been a kind of light, the light of the threshold, the light of the between place, the light that was not the sun's light and not the moon's light, but something older and more particular, something that illuminated the edges of things without casting the harsh shadows that direct light cast, something that made visible what direct light made invisible by being too bright for the nuances of what it touched. The torches lit the roads. Each road received the same light, the same quality of illumination, the same invitation to be seen and known. She did not angle the torches toward one road and away from another, did not use the light to suggest a preference she did not have. This was the fundamental principle of the crossroads. Not direction, but illumination, not guidance toward, but vision of. The gift not of knowing where to go, but of being able to see clearly enough to make the choice yourself. She stood in the middle of the meeting of ways with her torches raised and her three faces turned in their three directions, and the night moved around her in its slow and patient way. The stars above her carrying the light of her mother Asteria's nature in their 1,000 individual points, the earth beneath her carrying the deep and patient quality of her father Perseus's nature in its cold and enduring stone. She was exactly herself. In this place, at this convergence of roads, with the past behind her left face and the future before her right face, and the present inhabiting the center face with the full weight of everything the present always carried. In this place she was more completely herself than anywhere else, was the fullest expression of what she was the goddess of the threshold at her threshold, the keeper of the crossroads at her crossroads, the three-faced illuminator at the place where three roads met, and the choice of which road to take was always and entirely the traveler's own. The night held her. The torches burned. The dogs moved somewhere in the distance, their howling carrying across the dark landscape in the particular way of sounds that travel well at night, when the noise of the day has settled, and the air is still, and the only sounds are the sounds that belong to the dark. And in the space between the torches and the darkness, in the exact boundary between the lit and the unlit, something moved, something that was neither fully present nor fully absent, neither entirely in the visible world nor entirely outside it, something that occupied precisely the threshold between being seen and being unseen, as she had always occupied it, as she would always occupy it. The past face knew this from the long wait of everything that had been. The future face knew this from the long unspooling of everything that would be. And the present face simply was it, fully and without remainder, standing at the crossroads in the deep of the night with the torches burning and the three roads stretching away into the dark. The torches burned at the crossroads and the three roads stretched away into the dark, and the dogs moved in the far distance of the night, and Hecate stood at the center of the meeting of ways with her three faces turned in their three directions, fully herself, fully at rest in the only way that her nature knew how to rest, which was to be completely what she was in the place she was made for. Then the night deepened, not in the ordinary way that night deepens, not the simple darkening of the sky as the last light of the sun recedes below the horizon, and the stars strengthen in the increasing dark. This was a different quality of deepening. The deepening that happened at a particular point in the night's progress when the last human lights had gone out, and the villages and the settlements had given themselves over to sleep, and the surface world had released its grip on wakefulness and become entirely, completely the night's own. This was her time, not exclusively. The night belonged to many things, to the nocturnal creatures who moved through it with the ease of beings perfectly adapted to the dark, to the stars in their ancient courses, to the owls and the bats and the small quick things that had organized their entire lives around the hours of the dark and would not have traded them for any number of lit afternoons. But among the divine presences that moved through the night, Hecate was the one most native to it, the one whose nature was most completely expressed by the particular quality of what the night was. She had a relationship with the night that was different from any relationship she had with the day. In the day she was present. She moved through the lit world in her way, attending to the edges and the thresholds as she always attended to them, standing at the crossroads that existed in the daylight hours as surely as they existed in the dark, receiving the mortals who came to her in the full light of the afternoon with their ordinary confusions and their need for illumination. She was not absent from the day, but she was thinner in it somehow, less fully expressed, the way a star is present in the daytime sky but invisible, not extinguished but simply not yet visible, waiting for the condition that would make it most fully itself. The night was that condition. In the night she became what she most completely was. The quality of the night was not the absence of the day's qualities, not simply a darkness where the light had been, a quiet where the noise had been, a stillness where the movement had been. It was its own fullness, the fullness of a world that had put aside the particular concerns of the lit hours and was doing something different, attending to something that the day did not attend to, being present to something that the day's noise and brightness made impossible to perceive. She had spent a very long time learning what that something was. It was not a single thing. It was the quality of everything that lived at the edges, expressed collectively, the sum of all the marginal and threshold things becoming more present when the center of the world's attention, which was the sun, which was the day, which was the lit and busy surface of the world going about its ordinary business, had withdrawn. When the center withdrew, the edges became the center, and what had been peripheral became primary. and the night was the condition under which this reversal occurred. She walked through it. She walked through the night the way she walked through everything, from the edges, from the boundary places, following the threshold wherever it led, the edge of the wood where the trees gave way to the open ground, the bank of the river, where the water and the land negotiated their endless boundary, the ridge of the hill where the slope changed direction, and the sky met the earth in the long line of the horizon. She walked these edges in the dark with her torches held before her, and the torches lit the boundary between the lit and the unlit, which was the most fundamental threshold of all. Her dogs ran ahead of her. They ran with the easy confidence of animals perfectly suited to their purpose and their terrain. Their forms barely visible in the dark ahead of the torches, their presence more felt than seen, the sound of their passage through the night vegetation more real than their shapes. They howled sometimes, and the howling carried across the dark landscape in the way of all sounds that travel well at night, that find in the stillness of the dark a medium more receptive than the busy air of the day. The howling was a signal, not a threat. She had no interest in threatening, not a summons, not a warning in any adversarial sense. It was simply the sound of her approach, the announcement to the night world that she was moving through it, the way the sound of the wind announces itself before it arrives, the way the sound of the river announces itself before the river is visible. It gave time to those who needed time, the shy things, the cautious things, the things that preferred to be somewhere else when a goddess passed. It gave time to those who needed to be elsewhere, and those who remained were those who were not troubled by her presence or who were drawn to it. She walked through the night, and the night walked with her. Then the moon disappeared, not in the ordinary cycle of its phases, not the waning crescent giving way to the dark moon in the usual monthly rhythm. She had known that rhythm since before the Olympians were born, had known the moon in all its phases with the particular intimacy of a being whose most sacred time was the dark of the moon, whose fullest presence was felt not when the moon was full and bright and casting its silver light across the landscape, but when it was absent, when the sky was most completely itself, when the stars that were her mother Asteria's legacy were most visible in the uncomforted dark. She stopped walking. She raised her face to the sky, all three faces each in its own direction, and felt the quality of the moonless night the way you feel a familiar room when you enter it in the dark, not by sight but by presence, by the particular feeling of the space that belongs to that room and no other. The dark moon was the time of fullest magic. This requires explanation, and the explanation requires care, because the word magic has accumulated so many layers of later meaning, the spectacular, the theatrical, the association with trick and illusion, that arriving at what magic actually meant, in the oldest and most honest sense, requires some of those layers to be gently set aside. Magic, in its truest meaning, was not the spectacular intervention of divine power in the ordinary world. The gods had that. Zeus threw his thunder and the sky cracked. Poseidon struck the earth and it shook for miles. That was not magic. That was power, which was different. Direct, visible, immediately causal, the force of one nature pressing against the world until the world changed shape. Magic was something quieter and older and more precise than power. Magic was the art of the threshold, the knowledge of where one thing ended and another began, and the ability to work in that space, in the gap between the states, in the moment of transition when the normal rules of either side relaxed their grip and something else became possible. Magic was the art of the between sleeping and waking, between living and dying, between what was and what might be, between the visible world and the world that existed just at the edges of visibility. This was Hecate's art. She had been practicing it since before the concept of practice existed, since before any mortal had looked at the edges of things and understood that they were different from the centers, since before the word for what she did had been invented. She had been practicing it because it was what she was, because the threshold was her native element, and working in the threshold was as natural to her as breathing was to the living. On the night of the dark moon, this art was at its strongest. The dark moon was itself a threshold. The moon in its full phase was one thing, present, visible, casting its light, a body in the sky with definite form and definite position. The new moon was another thing, absent, invisible, preparing for the first thin crescent of its return. And the exact dark, the night when the moon was between these two states, was neither, was the threshold between the moon's absence and its presence, the moment when it was most completely in the between place that was her natural territory. In the dark of the moon, the edges of things were most permeable. The boundary between the sleeping world and the waking world, which was usually maintained with the same reliable solidity as any other boundary, became more flexible, more open to movement in both directions. The boundary between the visible and the invisible, between what ordinary eyes could see and what could only be seen by the kind of attention that spent its existence at the edges, became thinner. The boundary between the living world and the world of the dead, which was the deepest and most fundamental boundary of all, became for one night of the month more like a membrane than a wall, capable of being leaned against, capable of transmitting what was on either side of it in ways that the ordinary nights did not permit. She moved through the world on the night of the dark moon, with a quality of presence that was different from her presence on other nights, not more powerful in the simple sense, not louder or more visible or more imposing. The difference was subtler and more significant than any of those things. She was more fully in the world on the dark moon night, more completely present across the full range of the threshold places she inhabited, more entirely herself in the way that a tuning fork is most entirely itself when the note it is made to produce is sounded around it, the resonance lifting what was already its nature into its fullest possible expression. She walked to the place where the living world and the world of the dead were closest. There were several such places in the world she knew, places where the stone was old enough and the ground thin enough that the distance between the surface and the underworld was shorter than usual, where the quality of Hades's kingdom pressed upward through the earth in a way that the sensitive and the attentive could feel as a slight heaviness in the air, a slight cooling of the temperature, a slight quality of depth beneath the surface of things that was not visible but was unmistakably present. She had known these places since the beginning of her existence. She visited them regularly, with the attention of someone who was responsible for the threshold between the living and the dead, in a way that even Hades, for all the completeness of his kingdom, was not. Hades ruled what was already on his side of the boundary. She attended to the boundary itself. She knelt at one of these thin places and pressed her hands flat against the ground, and felt what was below, the vast and quiet dark of the underworld, the rivers moving in their patient way, the souls in the asphodel meadows, the warmth of the Elysian fields far below, and further below still the absolute dark of Tartarus. She felt all of it through the stone with the particular sensitivity of a being who had spent her existence learning the qualities of thresholds, and she felt the thinness of the boundary at this place, and she felt it hold. The boundary always held. This was important. The work of the dark moon was not to dissolve the boundary between the living and the dead, but to attend to it, to know its quality, to sense any places where it was under unusual strain or where something on either side was pressing too hard against it. She was the guardian of these thresholds in a way that was not dramatic, and was not visible, and was not the kind of guardianship that stories were easily told about, but was as real and as necessary as any guardianship in the world. She rose from the ground and walked on. The night was very still. In the distance, the dogs moved through the dark in their own searching way, their noses close to the ground, following whatever trails the night had laid. She could feel their presence in the way she felt all her companions, not as separate beings attached to her by any bond of ownership or command, but as extensions of her own awareness moving through the dark, covering the ground she was not covering, attending to the edges she was not attending to in this moment. She came to a crossroads on the dark moon night. This crossroads was not the same crossroads she stood at ordinarily. All crossroads were hers, but this one had a particular quality that distinguished it from the others. It was old, older than the others she visited, older perhaps than most things in the landscape around it. The stone at the center where the three paths met was worn with the passing of countless feet across countless years, worn in the particular way of stones that have been stood on by beings who were paying attention, who were fully present to what they were standing on, who gave the ground beneath their feet a quality of attention that ordinary walking did not give. She stood at the center of it. The dark above her was complete. No moon, no thin crescent, nothing but the full presence of the starlit sky, the stars shining with the particular clarity that only the moonless night produced, each one its own source of light, the whole field of them together making the darkness luminous in the way that only a very dark and very clear night could be luminous. She raised her torches. The flames responded to the quality of the night, burning with a quality she could not have described, but that was unmistakably different from their quality on other nights. Brighter in a way that was not about the quantity of light they produced, but about the quality of what they illuminated, touching the edges of things more precisely, making visible the boundaries that the ordinary nights left in shadow. She stood at the dark moon crossroads with her torches raised and her three faces turned in their three directions, and the night moved around her in its ancient way, the stars turning in their slow and faithful courses, the edges of the world most completely themselves in the deepest dark of the month, and from the ground at her feet, in the spaces between the stones that had been worn smooth by 1,000 years of attentive standing, something grew. Small plants, dark-leafed, unremarkable in their appearance, the kind of plant that would be invisible in daylight, and was barely more visible now in the torchlight than it was in the full dark between the flames. But she knew them. She knew every plant that grew at the threshold places, and these were among the oldest of them, the plants that grew only here, only at the oldest crossroads on the darkest night of the month, that existed in no other condition, and produced in their leaves and roots and the chemical conversation of their cells a knowledge that no other plant possessed. She knelt and touched them. The leaves were cold and slightly damp with the dew that the night had laid across everything, and the cold of them was not unpleasant, but was the cold of something that had been shaped by the night, that carried in its temperature the quality of the dark hours as naturally as it carried its chlorophyll. She felt through the leaves the same quality she felt in the threshold places. The openness, the permeability, the quality of a living thing that existed in the between, and had organized its entire being around that existence. She was not alone at the crossroads. She was never alone at the crossroads, not in the sense of having companions always visible, always present in the ordinary way of company, but in the sense that the crossroads was never empty of presence, that the meeting of ways accumulated over its long history of being attended to a quality of presence that was not any single being's presence, but the sum of all the attentions it had ever received, all the offerings, all the kneelings in the dark, all the quiet askings of travelers who had stood here and not known which road to take. She felt all of it, past, present, and the future crossroads moments still to come. Her three faces held them all in the same wide awareness. The first traveler who had ever stood at this particular meeting of ways, and felt the particular quality of the place, and known, without knowing why they knew, that this was a threshold worth attending to. The countless travelers since, the travelers still to come, who would stand here in ages not yet arrived, and feel what their predecessors had felt, that slight deepening of awareness, that slight extension of the present moment beyond its ordinary dimensions, that quality of being briefly, genuinely at the threshold of something. She breathed the dark moon night in. The air tasted of the herbs at the crossroads edges, of the cold stone at the meeting of ways, of the particular quality of the night when it was most completely itself. Not the perfumed air of the summer day, not the sharp air of the winter morning, but the deep and complex air of the moonless night, which carried in it the smell of things that had no smell in the day, that released their quality only in the dark, that were most fully themselves in the condition that most fully expressed what they were. She breathed it out. The torches burned. The dogs moved somewhere far ahead in the dark, their howling carrying back to her across the stillness of the moonless night. The sound arriving at her three faces with three slightly different qualities. From the past face the echo of all the time she had heard this sound before. From the present face the immediate reality of this howling on this night. From the future face the long continuation of the sound into all the night still coming. She listened to all three, and the night held her at its center, at the crossroads between everything and everything else, in the dark that was not empty but full, in the silence that was not absent but present, in the quality of the between that was her oldest and most native element, as natural to her as the sea was natural to Poseidon, as the dark was natural to Hades, as the movement was natural to Kronos. The dark moon night moved through its hours, and at the center of the oldest crossroads, with the threshold plants growing in the cracks between the worn stones, and the stars turning in their ancient courses overhead, and the dogs running their search through the far dark of the surrounding night, the goddess of the threshold stood with her torches raised and her three faces seeing everything, and was completely, utterly, perfectly herself. The dark moon night moved through its hours, and the torches burned at the crossroads, and the threshold plants grew in their patient way between the worn stones. And Hecate stood at the center of the meeting of ways with her three faces, seeing everything that had been, and everything that was, and everything that would be, and the night held her in its ancient and complete embrace. Then she turned her attention to the edges of the fields, not the fields themselves. The fields were the centers of human agricultural life. the carefully tended and jealously managed ground where the grain grew and the vegetables came up in their rows, and the whole project of human sustenance organized itself around the reliable productivity of well-worked earth. The fields were Demeter's territory in the deepest sense, not just the grain goddess's domain in the formal divine sense, but the expression of her nature made into landscape, the particular quality of her attention and her care made visible in the productivity of cultivated ground. But the edges of the fields were different, where the cultivated ground ended and the uncultivated began, where the plow had stopped and the wild things had kept their hold on the soil, where the tended and the untended met in that narrow band of ground that was neither entirely one nor entirely the other. This was where Hecate's plants grew. This was where the most interesting chemistry in the botanical world quietly and without announcement conducted its ancient experiments with what was possible, when a living thing organized itself around the conditions of the between. She walked the field edges in the dark. She walked them with the particular attention of someone who was both cataloging and communing, who was not merely observing what grew here, but was in conversation with it, was engaging with the edge plants in the way that beings who share a nature engage with each other, with a recognition that went below the level of ordinary observation into something more direct, more mutual, more like the recognition that Kronos had felt when Enki arrived, than like the straightforward process of identification and classification. The plants knew her. This is not a metaphor. Plants do not know things in the way that conscious beings know things, do not have awareness in the mode of awareness that gods and mortals possessed, but they responded to her presence in the way that living things respond to the conditions that produced them, with an openness, a slight increase in the permeability of their surfaces, a quality of availability that was different from their quality when she was not present. The edge plants, which had been shaped by the same conditions that had shaped her, which had organized their entire being around the threshold existence that was her native element, recognized in her the most complete and powerful expression of what they themselves were, in a smaller and more chemical form. She gathered some and left others. The leaving was as important as the gathering. This was the first principle of her knowledge of plants, that the threshold was maintained by knowing not only what to take but what to leave, not only which boundary to cross, but which boundary to honor. A plant gathered at the wrong time, or in the wrong quantity, or without the acknowledgement of what it was and what it offered, was not the same plant as the same species, gathered with full attention and full respect for the conditions that had produced it. The chemistry was identical. The medicine was different. She had understood this since the beginning of her existence. It was the same principle she applied to everything she did. The principle that knowing where the edge was, and standing at it with full attention rather than crossing it without awareness, was the fundamental act of all the arts she practiced. Magic was not the application of force. Magic was the precise and attentive engagement with the threshold, the careful work of someone who knew exactly where one thing ended and another began, and could work in that exact space without disturbing either side of it more than was necessary. The herbs were the physical expression of this principle. She held what she had gathered, and felt in it the accumulated botanical knowledge of the edge, the particular chemistry of plants that had learned to hold contradictions in their cells, the way she held the 3 times in her 3 faces, that were neither entirely one thing nor entirely another, that healed in one dose and harmed in another, and navigated the boundary between those two states with a precision that required the same quality of knowledge to use well as it had required to produce. Poison and medicine were the same plant in different quantities. This was the oldest truth of her botanical knowledge, and it was a truth that the surface world was slow to understand because the surface world preferred clean categories, preferred a world in which healing things and harmful things were separate, in which the boundary between them was clear and stable and not subject to the kind of subtle variation that made the threshold plants so demanding to work with. The surface world wanted its medicines to be simply medicines and its poisons to be simply poisons, and the edge plants refused to cooperate with this preference, refused to be simply one thing or the other, persisted in being the threshold embodied in botanical form. She was patient with the surface world's preference for simplicity. She had always been patient with it. She understood where the preference came from the genuine difficulty of navigating a world where so many things were threshold things, where so many of the most important phenomena existed in that uncertain space between categories, where the medicine and the poison were the same plant, and the difference between them was a matter of precise knowledge rather than simple identification. In a world like that, the preference for clear categories was not foolishness, but a reasonable response to genuine complexity. She simply knew better. She had always known better, and the knowing was not a source of pride, but simply a condition of her existence. The way a river knows the shape of its bed not by having studied it, but by having moved through it. The way the edge plants knew the chemistry of the threshold not by calculation but by being it. She walked deeper into the night. The quality of the night changed as she moved further from the crossroads into the wilder country where the roads gave way to paths, and the paths gave way to game trails, and the game trails gave way to no trail at all. Only the landscape itself, the undirected expanse of the world that had not been organized by human movement or human purpose, that existed according to its own logic rather than the logic of cultivation and travel. Here the magic was strongest, not because the wild country was inherently more magical than the cultivated country. She did not organize the world into more magical and less magical places, did not have a hierarchy of the sacred that placed the wild above the tended. The magic was strongest here because the edges were most present here, most visible, most unmediated by the human organization that in the settled country imposed its own boundaries over the natural ones and sometimes obscured what was underneath. In the wild country, the edges were simply the edges. The boundary between the forest and the clearing was not also a fence line or a field margin or a road edge. It was only what it was, the place where the trees ended and the open ground began, maintained by the competition between root systems and the availability of light, natural and unmanaged, and therefore most purely itself. She moved along this boundary with the ease of a being in her own element, feeling the quality of it under her feet, and in the air around her, and in the slight change in temperature at the line where the shade of the trees gave way to the open sky. She thought about the mortals who had found their way to this kind of knowledge. They were rare, not because the knowledge was hidden. It was not hidden, was as available as the edge plants themselves, growing in plain sight along every field margin and road edge and forest boundary in the world. but because accessing it required a quality of attention that the ordinary life of the surface world did not naturally produce, required the willingness to exist at the margin rather than at the center, to take seriously what was peripheral rather than what was primary, to develop a sensitivity to the between places that most conscious beings moved through without noticing. The ones who found their way to it were the ones who had always lived at the edges, the healers and the herb gatherers, who spent their working lives at the field margins and the forest edges, the midwives who worked at the most fundamental threshold of all, the boundary between not being and being, the moment of birth that was the crossing of the ultimate threshold in the direction of life, the women who tended the dying, who worked at the other end of that same boundary, who sat with those who were crossing from being into not being, and attended to the quality of that crossing with the same care and the same knowledge that the midwives gave to the entry. These were her people, not because they had chosen her exactly, not because they had made any formal declaration of devotion or erected temples in her honor. They were her people because their work placed them, necessarily and continuously, at the threshold places that were her native territory. They worked in the between without always having a name for what they were working in, without always knowing that the particular quality of knowledge they had developed in their years of edge work was the same knowledge that the goddess of the Crossroads embodied in its fullest and most complete form. She moved through their work invisibly. She was present in the herb gatherer's knowledge of when to harvest and when to leave, in the particular quality of attention that the experienced herb gatherer brought to the field edge, in the feeling that many of them described and few could explain, the sense of being guided in their selection, of knowing without being told which plant was ready and which was not, which specimen to take and which to pass. This was not magic in the dramatic sense. It was the subtle presence of the goddess of the threshold, in the work of the threshold, the gentle illumination of the edge by the being who was most completely the edge made divine. She was present in the midwife's hands, in the quality of knowing that the experienced midwife developed across years of working at the threshold of birth. The knowledge of when to intervene and when to wait, when the process needed help, and when it needed only witnessing, the precise calibration of action and restraint that the threshold work required, and that no amount of theoretical knowledge could produce, that came only from standing at the threshold repeatedly and attending to it with full presence until the threshold taught you its own logic through the accumulated experience of attending to it. She was present in the care of the dying, in the quality of attention that the most skilled and most honest of the death attendants brought to the bedside, the attention that did not flinch from the reality of the threshold, that did not try to soften it into something less than what it was, that honored it as the most significant crossing any individual existence would make, and gave it the full quality of presence that significance required. She moved through those rooms in the dark hours, her torches carried low, their light not the bright light of the Crossroads, but something gentler, more intimate, the light appropriate to a crossing that was deeply personal rather than universally available. She extinguished neither flame. This was the principle she held in every form of her work with the threshold. To illuminate rather than to decide, to make visible rather than to determine, to be present to the crossing without imposing her own preference about which way the crossing should go. She held her torches in those rooms, and she lit the boundary between the living world and Hades's kingdom, and she let the dying person approach that boundary with as much clarity as the light could give them, and the choice of when to cross remained always and entirely theirs, in the same way that the crossroads traveler's choice of road remained always and entirely their own. She walked on through the wild country. The night around her was the most complete darkness of the dark moon, and in that darkness the threshold plants glowed faintly with their own quality of light, not the bioluminescent glow of the deep-sea creatures in Poseidon's kingdom, not a visible light exactly, but a quality of presence that her triple sight perceived in the dark in the same way that it perceived all threshold things, as a slight heightening of what was real, a slight increase in the density of what was there. She gathered as she walked, not systematically, not with the efficiency of someone filling a basket according to a list. She gathered the way the knowledge required, responsively, attending to each plant individually, feeling in each one the particular quality it had achieved in this specific location under these specific conditions, taking what was offered and leaving what was not, moving through the wild field edges with the unhurried thoroughness of someone whose entire existence was organized around the patient and precise engagement with exactly this kind of work. The basket she carried, if it was a basket, if the container for what she gathered could be described in any ordinary material term, was full of the night's harvest by the time the first faint quality of the not yet dawn began to press at the far eastern edge of the sky. Not dawn itself. Dawn was still a long way off, was still below the horizon, was still the future face's territory rather than the present face's experience. But the quality of the night was beginning to shift in the way it always shifted in the last hours before dawn. Not lighter, not quieter, but different in some way that was felt before it was seen. A slight change in the quality of the dark that announced the coming change without producing it yet. This was the threshold of the night, the boundary between the night and the day, the crossing that the night made every morning from one state into another, through the brief and beautiful interval of the dawn that was neither night nor day, but the threshold between them, the crossing that she always attended to with particular care because the threshold between the night and the day was among the most significant thresholds in the world, the place where the domain she was most completely herself in gave way to the domain where she was present but thinner, where the edges were still hers but the center belonged to something else. She stopped at the edge of a field. The edge plants around her feet held the last of the night's dew on their leaves, each drop carrying a small and perfect reflection of the star above it, each reflection carrying in miniature the quality of her mother Asteria's falling star nature. She looked at them, all three faces attending, the past face knowing the long history of this edge and these plants, the future face knowing the long future of them, the present face seeing only this, the dew and the stars and the edge of the field in the last deep dark before the dawn. She held what she had gathered. The night's harvest was real and specific, and would be used in the ways that such things were used, in the workings of those who called on her, in the healings and the crossings and the threshold attendings of those whose work placed them at the edge where her knowledge lived. The harvest was not symbolic. It was the product of real work done with real attention on real ground. It was the night made physical, the edge knowledge made into medicine and tool, and the material of the arts of the threshold. She breathed the last of the full dark in. The air of the darkest hour before dawn was different from the air of midnight, different from the air of the early evening. It had a quality that she had never been able to describe in any language. Not cold exactly, not warm, not the smell of any specific plant or mineral, but a compound quality, the sum of everything the night had been carrying in its long passage from dusk to this moment. All the threshold crossings and edge attendings and dark moon workings of the hours collected into the air and present in it, as a quality that the sensitive could feel and the attentive could recognize. She recognized it completely. It was the smell of the between at its most concentrated, the threshold air of the night's own threshold, and she breathed it, and was entirely herself in the breathing. The goddess of the crossroads at the crossroads of the night, the keeper of the edges at the edge of the dark, the three-faced illuminator, standing in the last and deepest dark of the moonless night with her torches burning and her harvest in her hands, and her dogs somewhere ahead in the dark, their howling carrying back to her across the stillness as a sound that was hers as completely and as naturally as the night itself was hers. The stars began almost imperceptibly to thin, not to disappear. They would not disappear until the dawn was much further advanced, but to thin, to become slightly less present in a way that was not visible as a change in their brightness, but was felt as a change in the quality of the sky, the first faint intimation of the coming light beginning to move through the dark in its gradual way. She turned her face toward the east, one face, the present face, the face that attended to what was here and now and actual, the face that lived in the moment of the breath, rather than in the long perspective of past or future. She turned that face toward the east, and felt the dawn approaching in the way she felt all threshold things approaching, with the complete and unhurried attention of a being whose entire existence was organized around the arrival and departure of states, the crossing of boundaries, the passage from one condition into another. The dawn was coming, the night was ending, and in the space between those two facts, in the brief and extraordinary threshold of the transition itself, Hecate stood at the field edge with her torches and her harvest and her dogs around her, and was entirely at home, as she was always entirely at home at the crossing between one thing and another, as she had always been and would always be, the keeper of the between, the guardian of the crossing, the three-faced goddess of the threshold, standing at the edge of the world's daily transformation with her torches burning in the last of the dark. The dawn pressed at the eastern edge of the sky, and the torches burned in the last of the dark, and the dogs moved through the field edges with their easy nocturnal confidence. And Hecate stood at the threshold of the night's ending with her harvest in her hands, and her three faces attending to everything that had been and was and would be, and the world turned in its faithful way toward the light. Then she heard the cry. It came from below, not from below in the ordinary sense, not from a valley or a hollow in the ground or a cave mouth at the foot of a hill, from below in the deeper sense, from the place below all places, from the direction that was not north or south or east or west but down, the direction that led through the stone and the deep earth and the cold dark layers of what was beneath the surface world to the place where Hades kept his kingdom, and the rivers moved in their slow eternal way. She stopped. She stood absolutely still, in the way that only beings of great attentiveness can stand still. Not the stillness of absence, not the stillness of a thing that has stopped moving because it has no reason to move, but the absolute and concentrated stillness of a consciousness that has just received a signal and is giving it the full weight of its attention before doing anything else at all. The three faces all turned inward, in the metaphorical sense of turning inward, all three attending to the same thing rather than their three separate directions, converging on what she had heard with the full force of her triple awareness. She listened again. The cry was gone. It had lasted for the duration of a single moment. Not long, not a sustained sound, nothing that the surface world above would have heard as more than the faintest possible echo if it had heard it at all. Most beings on the surface would not have heard it. The gods on Olympus had not heard it. Demeter, who was closer to her daughter than any other being in the world, had not yet heard it in the way of hearing that produces knowledge, had felt something, perhaps the first faint edge of the wrongness, but had not yet understood what the feeling meant. Hecate had heard it with all three of her faces at once. The past face had heard the long history of the voice that had made it, had heard every sound that voice had made since it first learned to make sounds, had heard it in the meadows of the world above, had heard it in the laughter of a young goddess moving through the surface world with the ease and the brightness of something entirely suited to the world it moved through. The future face had heard what the voice would become in the ages ahead. The different register, the deepened quality, the voice that would learn to be at home in two worlds and would move between them with a complexity that the present voice did not yet possess. And the present face had heard the cry itself, the specific sound of a specific moment of surprise and fear, the sound of a threshold crossed without preparation, the sound of a crossing that had not been chosen. She understood what had happened before she had finished understanding it. This was the nature of the triple sight. Understanding arrived whole rather than assembled. The pieces present simultaneously rather than gathered in sequence. She understood the cry and its source and its cause, and what it meant for the world above and the world below, and for the long turning of the seasons that would follow from it, all of it present in the single moment of hearing in the way that her three faces made all things present simultaneously. Persephone had been taken into the underworld. She stayed still for one more moment, not with indecision, which was not a quality her nature produced, not with uncertainty about what to do, but with the specific quality of stillness that preceded action when the action was important, the gathering of full presence before full movement. Then she moved. She moved through the world the way she always moved, from the edges, through the threshold places, along the boundaries between one condition and another, but faster than her usual movement, with a quality of purpose that was different from the quality of her ordinary night wandering, which was exploratory and unhurried, and attended to what presented itself. This movement was directed. This movement had a destination. She went to the shore first. The shore was the threshold between the living world and the deep, between the surface and what lay beneath it, between the element of life and the element that could take life, between the known and the vast unknown of the ocean's depths. It was one of the places where the distance between the world above and the world below was shortest, not in the geological sense, but in the threshold sense, in the sense of the quality of the place rather than the quantity of the distance. She stood at the waterline and called downward, not with her voice exactly. Her voice was for the surface world, was calibrated to the medium of air and the distances of the visible landscape. She called in the mode that belonged to the threshold between worlds, the mode that moved through stone and water, and the cold dark layers of the earth rather than through air, the mode that could be felt by anything sensitive enough to feel it anywhere in the connected system of the world's deep places. She felt it go down. The call moved through the water, and through the ocean floor, and through the layers of rock beneath, and further down through the cold and the dark toward the underworld. And she felt it travel with the clarity of someone who had spent an existence learning the qualities of the threshold, and could therefore feel the precise character of the medium she was sending her call through. The resistance of the deep stone, the particular conductivity of the ancient rock, the slight change in quality as the call crossed the boundary between the living geological world and the dead realm that lay below it. No answer came, not yet. She had not expected an immediate answer. The underworld operated at its own pace, which was the pace of everything that was final rather than provisional, the pace of what was permanent rather than what was passing. She waited with the patience of her nature, attending to the threshold she had called through, feeling its quality, learning from it what could be learned. Then she turned to the surface world and began her search. She moved through the world above in a way she had not moved through it since the early ages, comprehensively, deliberately, covering ground rather than attending to edges, moving through centers as well as margins with the focused purpose of someone who is looking for something specific and will not stop until it is found. She carried her torches at full height, their flames burning with the full force of her presence, rather than the gentle quality she maintained when she was working at the field edges in the ordinary nights. She questioned everything she passed. The sun, Helios, who saw everything that happened in the lit world from his daily passage across the sky, had seen, and he had chosen not to speak of it, with the particular discretion of a divine witness, who understood that what he had observed was consequential enough that speaking of it to the wrong ear at the wrong moment could make things worse. She found him, and she asked him with the directness of someone who has no interest in the social negotiations of divine politics, who wanted the information because the information was necessary, and was not going to accept any form of deflection. He told her what he had seen from his height, the meadow in Sicily, the narcissus, Persephone reaching for the flower, the earth opening, the descent. He told her with the quality of someone who had been holding this knowledge uncomfortably, aware that it needed to reach someone with the power and the nature to act on it, and that he had not been that someone. He gave her what he knew, and she received it without gratitude in the transactional sense. There was no time for the formalities of gratitude, and he understood this. She went to Demeter. She found the goddess already searching, already moving through the surface world with the frantic energy of a mother whose child was missing, already beginning to understand in the deep biological way of maternal connection that the absence was not ordinary, that what she was feeling was not the ordinary loss of a child temporarily elsewhere, but something more fundamental, a severing in the quality of connection that told her the distance was not geographical. Hecate came to her in the way she came to everything, from the threshold, from the edge of Demeter's awareness where perception gave way to the unknown. She came with her torches lit and her three faces present, and she told Demeter what she knew, which was more than Demeter knew, which was more than anyone on the surface world yet knew. She told it plainly. She did not soften it. She had learned long ago that the threshold between not knowing and knowing, when it needed to be crossed, was crossed most cleanly with honesty. That the attempt to ease the crossing by diluting the truth only prolonged the pain of the threshold, made the crossing take longer, made the grief that waited on the other side of the knowledge less manageable. rather than more, because it arrived in increments rather than all at once. She told Demeter that her daughter was in the underworld. The sound Demeter made was not a cry in the ordinary sense. It was the sound of a force that had been moving in one direction for all of its existence, suddenly meeting an obstacle of absolute resistance. The sound of a world organized around a specific kind of joy, discovering the specific kind of grief that was that joy's exact negative. It was the sound of the grain goddess at the moment when the grain goddess understood that the thing she loved most in the world was not in the world. Hecate received it. She stood beside Demeter and received the sound with all three of her faces, and did not flinch, and did not look away, and did not offer the false comfort of a reassurance she did not have. She was present to the grief in the way she was present to the threshold, completely, honestly, without the interference of her own preference for a different outcome. She was the goddess of the between, and she stood at the between of Demeter's grief, between the knowing and the not yet knowing what to do, between the devastation of the immediate loss and the gathering of what would be needed to respond to it. She held her torches. They burned steadily in the quality of their light, neither brighter nor dimmer than they had been. The same quality of illumination they always carried, the light that illuminated rather than decided, that made visible rather than directed, that held the torch so the one who needed to see could see and then made their own choices from what they saw. Demeter chose to search. This was not Hecate's choice to influence. The choice of where the grief went after it arrived was Demeter's, not hers. She had given the goddess what she knew, and she had stood beside the grief, and she had held her torches, and now the goddess of the grain was gathering herself in the way of a force finding its direction after an obstacle has redirected it, and the direction it was gathering itself toward was not rest and not acceptance, but the relentless mother force of finding. Hecate went with her, not as a guide exactly. She did not know more than Demeter about where Persephone was now, had not been given access to the internal geography of Hades's kingdom in the way she had been given access to the surface world's threshold places. But she knew the threshold between the surface world and the underworld in a way that no other being on the surface knew it, and that knowledge was what the search needed, was the instrument most suited to the work. They moved together through the surface world for 10 days. The 10 days had a quality that Hecate had not experienced before, even in all the long ages of her existence at the threshold places. They were days of a particular grief light, lit by the torches she carried but shadowed by what the torches illuminated. The world in the process of beginning to respond to Demeter's absence from her function, the grain not growing, the trees beginning to lose the quality of productivity, the earth communicating in its own way the loss it was experiencing through the loss of its goddess's attention. She moved through these days with her torches at full height. She moved through every threshold place she knew, every crossroads, every shore, every field edge, every cave mouth, every place where the quality of the surface world thinned toward the quality of the world below. She moved through them with the specific attention of someone looking not for what was ordinarily there, but for what was different, for the quality of absence that a crossing left in the threshold it had passed through, for the trace that Persephone's descent had left in the places where the world above met the world below. She found traces, not the crossing itself. That was long accomplished, long complete. The thresholds sealed in the way that thresholds sealed themselves after a significant crossing, the ground healed over, the surface restored to its appearance of ordinary ground, but the quality of what had passed through, the specific texture of a crossing made not by the dying but by the living. A different quality of trace, a different kind of mark on the threshold, something that her knowledge of the between recognized immediately, and that told her what the crossing had been and confirmed what Helios had told her. On the 10th day she went to the place where Persephone had been taken, the meadow in Sicily. She stood in it with her torches and her 3 faces and the dogs around her feet, and she felt the quality of the place with the full weight of her attention, and she felt what the meadow held, the memory of the narcissus, the particular quality of a threshold that had been used for a crossing of unusual significance, the texture in the ground that was the trace of a goddess going down. And then she felt something else, something that her right face had been carrying since she heard the cry, something she had known since the first moment of understanding, but had allowed to settle beneath the more immediate work of the search, waiting for the moment when the more immediate work was done, and she could give this thing the attention it deserved. She felt the shape of what was going to happen, not in detail. The future phase never gave detail in the way of a story told in order, with one event following another in clean sequence. It gave the shape of things, the broad quality of how a situation was going to resolve, the direction rather than the specific steps. What she felt now, standing in the meadow where Persephone had descended, was the shape of a solution that would not be simple, and would not be clean, and would not give Demeter everything she wanted, and would not leave Hades with nothing, and would leave Persephone with a life that was more complex than the life she had been living in the meadow, but more complete. The life of a being who had crossed a threshold and been changed by the crossing and could not uncross it, but could find in the changed condition a wholeness that was different from and not lesser than the wholeness she had had before. She held this knowledge with the patience of someone who knew that the shape was real, but the path to it was long and would need to be walked step by step, that the knowledge of the destination did not shorten the journey, that the only way through a threshold was through it, not around it. She turned from the meadow. She descended, not into the underworld itself, not yet, not in the way of the full descent that would come later, the seasonal descent she would make with Persephone as her companion and her guide through all the long ages of the world. She descended to the threshold between the worlds, to the thin places she knew, and she stood there with her torches lit, and she called downward again, and this time the call carried something different from the first call. It carried the specific quality of what she was, the goddess of the threshold, the being who stood between worlds and lit both sides with the same quality of light, who had no preference between the world above and the world below, but stood between them with her torches burning, and offered the illumination that both sides needed to see each other clearly. She called and she waited, and in the underworld, very far below, in the vast cold quiet of the kingdom of the dead, something shifted in the quality of the silence. Something that had been sealed was slightly less sealed. Something that had been complete in its enclosure became slightly more permeable, as if the threshold between the worlds had felt the quality of the being standing at it, and had responded, as thresholds always responded to her, with a slight increase in openness, a slight decrease in resistance. She held her torches to the thinness between the worlds. Their light moved downward through the stone in the way that light does not ordinarily move through stone, in the way that only the most particular quality of threshold illumination could move, reaching down through the geological layers toward the kingdom below. She felt it reaching. She felt it entering the dark of the underworld in the way that the first light enters a room before dawn, not flooding it, not transforming it, but being present in it in a way it had not been present before, offering a quality of illumination that did not demand any particular response, but was simply there, available, real. Somewhere very far below, in the cold of the underworld, a young goddess who had been sitting in a palace of black stone and feeling the quality of her own crossing for 10 days, felt something shift in the quality of the dark around her. Not warmth, not sunlight, nothing that the surface world would have recognized as comfort or as rescue. Something more subtle and more real than either of those things. The particular quality of illumination that Hecate's torches produced when they were turned toward a threshold. The light that said simply, "This is a boundary. Both sides are real. The crossing was real, and the world you are in is real, and the world you came from is real, and both of them are held in the same quality of attention." Persephone felt it. She felt it with the part of herself that had always been sensitive to the quality of threshold places, that had grown up on the surface world close to the edges of things, close to the deep knowledge that lived at the margins, the part that was her mother's daughter and also already, the part that was beginning to become what she was going to be. She breathed. And above, at the thin place between the worlds, with her torches burning and her dogs around her, and her 3 faces present in their 3 directions, Hecate felt the breath move upward through the stone, and felt it arrive at the threshold where she stood, and felt in it what she had known her right face would show her. The first small movement of the long resolution. The first step in the journey through the crossing that could not be uncrossed toward the wholeness that was different from and not lesser than what had been before. She held her torches steady, the threshold held between them, and the 10 days of searching had led here. To this thin place in the stone, to this quality of light moving through the layers of the world, to this first and tentative and entirely real connection between the goddess above and the goddess below, mediated by the only being in the world who stood between them both. The torches burned at the thin place between the worlds, and the light moved downward through the stone, and Persephone breathed in the cold dark of the underworld palace, and Hecate stood at the threshold between them with her 3 faces present and her dogs around her feet, and the connection held between the world above and the world below in the quiet and particular way of things that are new and real and not yet fully understood by either side. Then the resolution came. It came in the way that the future face had shown her it would come. Not cleanly, not simply, not with the satisfying finality of a problem solved and a situation restored to its previous condition. It came as a compromise, which is to say, it came as the only solution available when 2 equally powerful claims press against each other across a boundary that neither side can simply override. Demeter's claim was absolute. Hades's claim was absolute. Persephone's own nature, which was still being understood and was in the process of becoming something it had not previously been, was present in the resolution in a way that the older stories did not always acknowledge clearly, but that Hecate, who had attended to the crossing from both sides, understood completely. The pomegranate seeds, she had felt this coming too, had felt it in the quality of the thin place between the worlds, in the texture of the underworld's response to her calls, in the particular way that the resolution was shaping itself in her right face's vision, not as something imposed from outside, but as something that arose from the nature of the situation itself, the way a river's course arises from the shape of the land through which it moves, not chosen but inevitable, given what the land was and what water did. The seeds were the threshold made edible. She understood this with the precision of someone who had spent an existence learning the chemistry of threshold plants. The plants that healed and harmed in different quantities. The plants that were neither entirely one thing nor entirely another. The pomegranate of the underworld was the most complete expression of this principle. The threshold plant at its fullest development, the plant that lived at the boundary between the kingdom of the living and the kingdom of the dead, and had organized its entire being around that boundary, in the same way that the edge plants of the surface world organized themselves around the edges of fields and forests. To eat it was to become a threshold being, not entirely living, not entirely dead, not entirely of the surface world, not entirely of the underworld, not entirely Demeter's daughter in the old uncomplicated way, not entirely Hades's queen in any complete and permanent sense, both, the threshold between both, the being who crossed between the worlds with the seasons, who was present in one and then in the other, who carried the quality of each world into the other on her seasonal crossings, and who was, by the act of her crossing, the connection between them that made each of them more fully itself. Hecate felt the resolution settle into place the way stones settle into the bed of a stream, one by one, each finding its position, each taking slightly longer than you expect to arrive at its final rest, and then all at once the bed is stable, and the water runs over it clearly, and what had been turbulent is smooth. She was the one who went down. This is the part of the story that is told in different ways by different sources, and the differences are worth attending to because they say something important about what Hecate was and what her role in this resolution was. Some versions say she accompanied Hermes on the descent to bring Persephone back. Some versions say she met Persephone at the threshold on the way up. What all the versions agree on is that she was there, that the crossing from the underworld back to the surface world, the first crossing, the first seasonal return, was made with Hecate present, with her torches lighting the way. She descended through the thin place. The descent was different from the descent that Hades made when he claimed his kingdom, different from the descent that Orpheus made with his grief music, different from the descent that Heracles made with his uncomplicated courage. Those descents moved from the living world to the dead world in the direction of the one-way crossing, in the direction that all things moved eventually. Her descent moved in the same direction and was not one way. This was the distinction that her nature made possible. She was the being of the threshold, the being who moved between rather than through, who crossed in both directions because her nature was the crossing itself rather than either side of it. She went down through the stone. The quality of the world changed around her as she descended, in the way she had felt it change when she pressed her hands to the ground at the thin places and felt what was below. The living earth gave way to the deep stone. The deep stone gave way to the cold of the geological dark. The cold of the geological dark gave way to the particular quality of the underworld's atmosphere, which was not the atmosphere of the living world but was not its simple absence, was something of its own, the air of a place that had been breathed by the dead for all the ages of the world's existence. She carried her torches into the underworld. Their light moved through the gray quality of the kingdom in a way that was different from the way her torches lit the surface world. On the surface, the torches illuminated the dark against the general background of the living world's light. They were additions to a world that already had light, supplements to the sun and the moon and the stars. Here they were the only warm light in a world of cold gray, the only fire in a world where fire of the ordinary kind did not exist, the only source of the particular quality of illumination that belonged to the threshold between the living and the dead, rather than to either side alone. The underworld felt her. She felt it feel her, felt the slight change in the quality of the gray light, the slight adjustment of the sourceless atmosphere, the quality of a very old and very stable and very complete place encountering a presence that was not entirely at home in it, because it was not entirely at home anywhere, because its home was the threshold rather than any fixed location. The underworld received her the way it received everything, with the absolute and patient acceptance of a place that had no preferences about what arrived, that contained all things without hierarchy, that gave the same gray quality of reception to heroes and beggars and ordinary people, and now to the goddess of the Crossroads, moving through its levels with her torches at full height. She found Persephone in the palace. She was in the courtyard where the pale flowers grew. The impossible flowers that had appeared in the cold ground of the underworld palace, that had no right to exist here and existed anyway, that were the first evidence of what the queen of the underworld was going to be and do to the world she had been brought to. Persephone was sitting among them with the quality of someone who has been in a place long enough to stop fighting it and has not yet fully accepted it, who exists in the particular threshold between resistance and belonging that was one of the most difficult thresholds Hecate knew. She came to her in the way she came to everything, without announcement, without the approach of a more powerful being making its presence felt from a distance. She simply arrived at the edge of the courtyard and stood there with her torches and let herself be seen when Persephone chose to look up. Persephone looked up. What passed between them in that first moment of seeing each other in the underworld was not something that language captured cleanly, because language was built for the surface world and its categories: joy and grief, comfort and loss, reunion and separation. And what happened between them was none of those things exactly, was something that existed in the between of those categories, the way all the most real things existed in the between of the categories that try to contain them. Recognition, perhaps, the recognition of one threshold being by another. Persephone, who had crossed the most significant threshold of her existence and been changed by the crossing in ways she was only beginning to understand, seeing in Hecate the being who was most completely what Persephone was in the process of becoming, the being who had always lived between worlds, who had never had the luxury of full membership in any single realm, who had made of that condition not a deprivation but a wholeness of a different kind. Hecate sat beside her among the pale flowers. She set her torches in the cold ground of the underworld courtyard, and their flames burned with the quality she had brought down from the surface world, the quality of threshold illumination that was different from the underworld's gray light and different from the surface world's sunlight, and was something that existed between both of them, carrying the qualities of each without being identical to either. The flowers in the courtyard seemed to respond to the torchlight in their faint and chemical way, the same response she felt in the edge plants of the surface world, the recognition of something that shared their threshold nature. She spoke, not with comfort, not with the reassurances that a simpler being in a simpler role might have offered, with honesty, which was what she had always given to those who came to her crossroads, which was what the threshold required of anyone who stood at it faithfully. She spoke about what had happened with the same clarity that she had spoken to Demeter, not softened, not made into something less than it was, but held with the full and honest quality of a truth that needed to be seen clearly in order to be lived with. She spoke about the crossing. She spoke about what it meant to have crossed a threshold of this significance, and to be, now, permanently on the other side of it, in the sense that no crossing of such weight was entirely reversible. The surface world was still real. The return was real, was coming, was the shape of the resolution that was settling into place above them as they sat among the flowers. But the return would not be the return of someone who had never left. It would be the return of someone who had been below and had come back, who carried the underworld in them, in the way that all significant crossings are carried by the one who makes them. She spoke about the torches. She told Persephone what the torches were for, not for the goddess herself, who did not need them to see, but for the ones who crossed the threshold behind her, the ones who would make their own crossings through whatever threshold their lives brought them to, who would need the light not to cross for them, but to illuminate the crossing so they could make it with their own eyes open. She told her that this was the work, the holding of the light, the standing at the threshold, the being present to the crossing without taking the crossing away from the one who needed to make it. Persephone listened with the quality of someone who was hearing something they already knew made explicit for the first time. Then Hermes came. He arrived in the way he always arrived, in the between space, in the gap between one moment and the next, with the ease of someone who was as comfortable in the underworld as on the surface, because he was the being of transition, and transition was everywhere. He came with the authority of Zeus's resolution, the formal settlement of the dispute between Demeter and Hades that had been reached in the absence of the principles most directly involved, the way many settlements of disputes between very powerful beings were reached. Persephone rose. She rose from among the pale flowers, and she looked at the torches still burning in the cold ground, and she looked at the gray quality of the underworld light, and she looked at Hecate with the expression of someone who is about to cross a threshold and knows what the crossing is going to cost, and is going to make it anyway. Hecate took up her torches. She walked beside Persephone and Hermes through the levels of the underworld toward the threshold between the worlds, and she felt the quality of the underworld around her as she moved through it. The rivers, the fields, the deep cold silence, the presence of Hades somewhere in the palace she was walking away from, the particular quality of a kingdom that had been changed by what had entered it, and was still in the process of understanding the change. She lit the way. The ascent was through the same thin place where she had descended, the same place where she had stood and called downward, and held her torches to the stone and felt the light moving through the layers of the earth. Moving upward through it was different from moving downward through it, in the way that all ascents are different from all descents. The same path, the same medium, but the direction itself, changing the quality of the movement, the quality of what was being left behind and what was being moved toward. She felt the underworld recede below her. She felt the quality of the stone changing from the deep cold of the geological dark to the warmer, more complex quality of the living earth, the earth that had weather in it and roots in it, and the slow chemical conversation of a million living things conducting their lives in its layers. She felt the living world coming to meet her from above, pressing down through the stone with the quality of everything that had been waiting. Demeter's grief organized into the particular directed force of a mother's need, the surface world's hunger and cold, the growing urgency of a situation that had been held in suspension for 10 days and needed its resolution. They emerged. The light hit all three of her faces at once. The past face, the present face, the future face, and all three received the light of the surface world after the gray of the underworld. And the receiving was not overwhelming the way it would have been for a being whose nature was not the threshold, was not the between. It was simply the other side, the other quality, the other light that her torches burned between. She received it as she received everything, with complete and unhurried attention, giving it the full quality of her awareness without being flooded by it. Demeter found her daughter. Hecate stood at the edge of the reunion, and let it be what it was, which was the complete and overwhelming force of a connection restored after a separation that had threatened to be permanent. She did not insert herself into it. She did not make her presence felt in any way that would have drawn attention toward herself, and away from what was happening between the mother and the daughter. She simply held her torches and was present, and let the reunion take the full space it needed without management or direction. Then the world responded. Demeter's return to her function was not gradual. It was immediate, the way the release of a very long tension is immediate, the way a river flows the moment the dam is removed. The grain remembered what it was. The trees remembered their leaves, the ground softened, and the sky cleared, and the long cold absence of Demeter's attention resolved itself into the particular urgency of spring, which is what happens when an entire world's growth is compressed into the interval between the winter's ending and the spring's arriving. Hecate watched it. She watched the surface world remember itself with the quality of attention she gave to all threshold crossings. The complete and honest attention of a being who understood that what was happening was significant and required witnessing. The return of Persephone from the underworld was the world's first experience of the seasonal crossing. The first time the boundary between the living world and the dead world had been crossed in the direction of return at the specific moment when the world needed that return most. It would happen again. She knew this with the certainty of the right face's vision. It would happen every year across all the ages of the world, the same crossing in the same direction at the same time of year. The world above responding each time with the same urgency of spring, the world below accepting each autumn departure with the same quality of patient waiting, and each time, at the beginning of each descent and the end of each ascent, she would be there. This became her other work, the work of the crossroads and the threshold plants, and the dark moon wandering continued as it had always continued. But alongside it, in the pattern of the year, there was now this, the accompaniment of Persephone on her seasonal crossings, the holding of the torch at the descent, and the holding of the torch at the ascent, the being present at the most significant seasonal threshold in the world with the same quality of attention she brought to all thresholds and all crossings. She was the torch-bearer. This was the name that some of the old texts gave her, and among all her names and all her titles, it was perhaps the most honest, the most direct, the most completely expressive of what she was. Not the goddess of the crossroads only, not the mistress of magic only, not the keeper of the dark moon only, the torchbearer, the being who held the light at the threshold so that others could see to cross. She walked beside Persephone on the first descent of autumn. The leaves were beginning to change in the way they changed at the edge of the season, the surface world beginning its own threshold, crossing from the abundance of summer into the resting of winter. The cycle of growth and completion doing what it had always done and would always do. She walked beside the queen of the underworld through the thinning of the surface world toward the thin place in the stone, and she held her torches, and the light they gave moved ahead of them both as they descended. The underworld received them. The pale flowers in the courtyard were still there, still blooming in their impossible cold ground way, still expressing the quality of the world above that Persephone's presence had introduced into the kingdom of the dead. She saw them as she came through the palace gate, and felt in the seeing what her right face had been showing her since the resolution settled. The quality of what this kingdom was becoming, the way the boundary between the living world and the dead world was becoming through Persephone's seasonal presence and through her own attendant torch-bearing, more permeable without being less real, more connected without being less distinct. The threshold between the worlds was not dissolving, it was deepening, becoming more itself, becoming what the best thresholds always became. Not barriers between what was on either side, but meeting places, not walls but membranes, not ends, but the extraordinary and specific kind of beginning that only a threshold could produce, the beginning that was only possible at the exact place where one thing ended and another began. She set her torches in the courtyard of the underworld palace, and the pale flowers turned their impossible faces toward the light. Above, the autumn continued its crossing into winter. Below, the queen of the dead was home, and the torchbearer sat among the pale flowers with her flames burning between the worlds and the threshold held. The torches burned among the pale flowers in the courtyard of the underworld palace, and the threshold held between the worlds, and Persephone was home in her season below, and Hecate sat in the cold gray light of the kingdom of the dead, and felt the particular quality of being in a place that was not her home and was not foreign to her, that she moved through with the ease of a being for whom no single place was home, because all threshold places were home, and the underworld was the threshold of thresholds, the deepest boundary of all. Then she rose and walked back to the surface. She always returned. This was the nature of her relationship with the underworld, which was different from Persephone's relationship, and different from Hades's relationship, and different from the relationship of the dead who were there permanently. She came, and she bore her torches, and she witnessed the crossing, and she left, because her work was not in any single place, but at the boundary between places, and the boundary needed her on both sides of it, and spending too long on either side was to cease being what she was, to become a resident rather than a threshold keeper. She returned to the surface world in the autumn quality of the season. The world above was in its own crossing. The leaves had passed through the threshold of their changing and had fallen. The trees were bare with the particular bare quality of things that have released what they were carrying, and stand now in the clear cold air with their structure visible, their form honest, their architecture revealed by the loss of what had obscured it through the growing months. The world was at the threshold between the abundance of summer and the rest of winter, and the quality of this threshold was the quality she loved best in the surface world, the clear, cold honesty of a thing that had stopped performing its fullness, and was simply what it was underneath all of that. She walked through the autumn world with her torches and her dogs and her harvest knowledge and her triple sight. She walked and she thought about the ones who had found their way to her over the long ages of her existence. The ones who had come to the crossroads and the field edges and the dark moon nights with a quality of need or devotion or simple attentiveness that had created between them and her the particular relationship that mortals sometimes had with a divine presence that matched their own deepest nature. She thought about Circe first. Circe was the daughter of Helios and the Oceanid Perse, which made her the granddaughter of an Oceanid. She carried in her nature the quality of the sea's edges and the sun's far vision, and something older than either of those things, something that had been in the Oceanid blood since the first age of the world. She had found her way to magic through the particular combination of those inheritances, the light that revealed and the deep water that concealed. Between those two forces the threshold where transformation was possible. She had called on Hecate, not at a crossroads exactly. Circe's crossroads was an island. The island of Aya, where she had been exiled for the extremity of what her magic had done, the transformation of the unwilling that had made her both famous and alone. The island was a threshold place in the geographical sense, surrounded by water on all sides, neither the mainland nor the open sea, the in-between place that an island always was, and she had made of it what Hecate made of all threshold places, a home. Their relationship was not the relationship of supplicant and deity. It was more complex than that, more mutual. Circe had found, in the long years of her island exile, a quality of magic that was close to Hecate's own quality. The magic of transformation, which was the magic of the threshold in its most concentrated form, the art of standing at the boundary between one state and another, and knowing exactly how to facilitate the crossing. Her herbs were Hecate's herbs, her knowledge of the edge plants and their chemistry, the same knowledge that Hecate had been carrying since before the first field was plowed and its edges left to grow wild. She had found it herself. This was what Hecate respected most about Circe, that the knowledge had not been given but discovered, that the art had not been taught but arrived at through the same quality of attention to the edges of things that Hecate herself embodied. The goddess of the threshold did not give out her art like a gift or a privilege. She was present to those who developed their own sensitivity to the threshold, who showed by the quality of their engagement with the between places that they had the nature for it, that the knowledge was not going to be misused in the sense of being applied without the respect for the boundary that all threshold work required. Circe had the nature for it. She moved through her transformations with a precision that was not always kind and was always exact, the exactness being the quality that Hecate recognized and respected, the quality of someone who knew where the edge was and could work in that exact space with the same precision that the threshold required. The transformations were not random, were not the careless exercise of power. They were the expression of a nature encountering other natures at the exact boundary between what those natures were and what they were capable of becoming. And the transformation was always the true form revealed, always what was already there made visible. She visited Circe on the island sometimes. She went in the way she went everywhere, from the edge, arriving at the threshold of the island from the seaside where the water gave way to the shore in the particular way that Circe's island shore had, which was different from ordinary shores in the quality that all threshold places belonging to threshold workers had, more present, more alive at the boundary. the meeting of water and land more fully itself than such meetings were in ordinary places. Circe always felt her coming. She felt it the way those who had developed the sensitivity felt all threshold crossings, as a change in the quality of the air at the shore, a slight deepening of the presence at the edge of the island, the feeling of being attended to that the Crossroads supplicants felt when they knelt in the dark. She would come to the shore and stand at the waterline and wait without performing the waiting, without the theatrics of supplication or the formality of divine greeting, simply present to what was arriving with the quality of attention that was the thing Hecate respected most in anyone. They talked about plants. This is the honest account of what their conversations were about, and it is worth noting because it is not what the later tradition made of Hecate's relationships with her devotees, which tended toward the dramatic, the invocations in the night, the powerful workings, the extreme situations. Those existed, but the substance of the relationship, the ongoing texture of what it meant to be in relationship with the goddess of the threshold, was much more like this: two beings with a shared knowledge of the edge plants sitting together at the edge of an island and talking about what grew there, what it did, how to calibrate the quantities, when to gather and when to leave. The knowledge was practical. This was important and was easily missed. The magic of the threshold was not the magic of the spectacular intervention, the lightning strike of divine power that changed things in a single visible moment. It was the slow and exact magic of knowing where the boundary was and how to work at it, patient, precise, requiring the same quality of long attention that the edge plants required to grow. Circe understood this. The long years of the island had taught her what could not be taught quickly. The knowledge that came only from sustained engagement with the threshold, from years of standing at the boundary between states and attending to what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. Then there was Medea. She was different from Circe in the ways that granddaughter and ancestor are different. The same root, a different expression. She carried the oceanid inheritance differently, the sea quality in her more volatile, more given to the sudden force of the deep water, rather than the patient tidal motion that characterized Circe's use of the same material. She was a princess of Colchis and a priestess of Hecate, which meant something specific and demanding, not a formal priesthood in the sense of the Olympian cults, not the regular performance of prescribed rituals in a designated space. It meant the devotion of someone who had organized their entire life around the knowledge of the threshold, who had made of themselves the most complete instrument of that knowledge that their nature allowed. She had paid the cost of it. This was the truth about Medea that the later stories sometimes simplified. The cost of the threshold knowledge, the price of organizing your existence around the between rather than the center. It made you capable of things that others could not do, gave you access to the chemistry of transformation and the knowledge of the boundary between states. It also placed you permanently at the edge of the ordinary world, not belonging fully to any community, not subject to the ordinary social bonds that held people in the safe center, not protected by the conventions that the center world offered to those who stayed within them. Hecate did not apologize for this. She had never promised that the threshold knowledge was without cost. She had never promised that standing at the crossroads was comfortable, in the way that standing at the center was comfortable. What she offered was illumination, the torches that lit all roads equally, the light that made visible without deciding, What those who came to her did with the visibility was their own, always and entirely their own. Medea had done extraordinary things with it. She had called on Hecate in the working that helped Jason take the golden fleece, had called on the goddess of the crossroads at the threshold of what was possible, had worked at the exact boundary between the human capacity for action and what lay beyond it. And the working had succeeded because it was done with the quality of attention the threshold required. Precisely, with full knowledge of the cost, with the respect for the boundary that all threshold work demanded. Hecate had heard the call. She was always present when the call was genuine, when the quality of need and knowledge that produced it was real rather than performed. She did not always answer in visible ways. She was the torchbearer, not the actor, the illuminator of the crossing, not the one who made the crossing for the one who needed to make it. But she heard and she was present, and the quality of her presence moved through the working the way her torchlight moved through the dark, not demanding to be seen but making visible what needed to be seen. She thought about all of them now as she moved through the autumn world, not with nostalgia. She was not a being given to nostalgia, which required a preference for the past over the present that her triple sight made impossible. She thought about them with the quality of attention she gave to everything in her past face's vision, clear, unhurried, the past as immediate and real as the present. All the moments of those relationships present to her in the same quality of awareness as the autumn leaves under her feet, and the cold air against her three faces, and the dogs running ahead of her in the gray morning light. She thought about the dogs. The dogs who ran with her were hers in a way that nothing else was entirely hers. Not as possessions, not as subordinates, but as companions whose nature was so completely aligned with her own that the distinction between what was her and what was them was in the deepest moments functionally meaningless. They ran through the night world ahead of her torches, and they found the threshold places by whatever canine sense was the dog equivalent of her triple sight, and they howled at the crossroads, and at the thin places, and at the dark moon sky with the sound of something that was fully and completely itself expressing that fullness in the most direct way available to it. They were the souls of women, some said. The old sources said this, and she did not correct it, because it was true in the way that many things about her were true. Not literally, in the sense of having been verified by any straightforward process of causation, but true in the way of a correspondence so deep that the distinction between metaphor and fact became unclear. The dogs who ran with her carried in their running and their howling something of the quality of those who had made the most extreme of threshold crossings. The crossing from life to death before the expected time, by violence rather than by the natural completion of the body's years. That crossing left something in the threshold, some quality of the between that was different from the ordinary death crossing, and that found in the running and howling of the goddess's dogs a form that suited it. She moved through the autumn world with them, and felt their presence around her as the most constant and most honest of her company. She thought about what it meant to have company. She had existed for a very long time, and had spent most of that existence at the edges of things, which was not always the same as being with others, which required a quality of sustained presence that the threshold worker did not always have to offer. Her company was the company of the crossing, intense, specific, present to the threshold moment, and then moving on, because the threshold was not a place to stop but a place to pass through. and being present to it required the freedom to be anywhere and everywhere it appeared, rather than the settled continuity that permanent companionship required. She did not regret this. She had understood it as the condition of her nature since the beginning of her existence, since the first night she walked the edges of the young world, and felt the quality of the between, and understood that this was where she was and what she was, and that what she was did not include the settled warmth of the center, the comfort of full belonging to a single place or a single community. What it included was this: the autumn world around her in the clear, cold morning light, the dogs running ahead with the easy confidence of things in their element, the three faces seeing in their three directions, the torches in her hands carrying the quality of the threshold light, the edge plants along the field margins and the forest boundaries, and the road edges, still holding their knowledge in their cells, still organizing their chemistry around the threshold existence that had always been the most interesting existence in the botanical world. The crossroads waiting ahead. She could feel it before she saw it, the way she always felt the crossroads before she reached it, as a quality of the ground beneath her feet changing slightly, a slight increase in the presence at the threshold, the accumulated weight of all the attentions the crossroads had ever received, beginning to press through the earth with the particular quality of a place that had been cared for across a very long time by a very consistent quality of attention. She arrived at it as the morning strengthened, not the dark moon crossroads of her fullest working. This was an ordinary crossroads on an ordinary morning, the kind that existed everywhere, that three roads met and travelers sometimes paused before choosing which way to continue. But ordinary crossroads were not less real than the ancient and heavily attended ones. They were newer, less worn, less loaded with the accumulated weight of devotion and attention and the countless kneelings in the dark. But they were the same threshold, the same meeting of ways, the same meeting of the past road and the two possible future roads in the single present point of the crossing. She stood at the center. The morning light fell on all three roads equally. The dogs sat at the edge of the roads in their patient way, watching the empty morning with the quality of attention that dogs in threshold places always had, which was more than the ordinary watchfulness of animals and less than the awareness of beings with the full triple sight. They watched and she stood, and the morning moved through its early hours. Then a traveler came, a young man, moving along the road from the direction of the east with the quality of someone who had been walking for a long time and was approaching a decision that the distance of walking had not yet resolved for him. He came to the crossroads and stopped in the way that travelers always stopped. The slight hesitation, the looking down each of the roads ahead, the quality of someone standing at the external expression of an internal condition that was much more complex than the choice of which road to take. He could not see her. She was present in the quality of the crossroads morning, in the particular clarity of the light at the meeting of ways, in the slight deepening of the air at the center of the crossing, in the feeling of being attended to that the crossroads always produced in those sensitive enough to feel it. She was not visible in the ordinary sense, not a figure that the young man could point to and identify. She was present as the threshold is always present, as the quality of the place itself, rather than as a distinct presence within it. He stood at the center of the crossroads. He looked north and he looked west, and something in the quality of the morning shifted around him, in the way it always shifted when someone stood at the crossroads with their full attention, when the choice they faced was real, and the quality of their need was genuine, and the crossing was not symbolic but actual, when they were truly at the threshold of their life and truly did not know which way to go. She raised her torches. They burned in the morning light with the quality that was hers, not the light of the sun that was already present in the morning, not a competing brightness, but something different, something at the edge of visibility, the threshold light that was most fully itself in the dark, but was present even in the day for those with the sensitivity to feel rather than see it. He felt it. She could feel him feel it. The slight change in his quality of standing, the slight deepening of his attention, the shift from the surface confusion of practical choice to the deeper attention of someone who has felt something real at a crossroads and is allowing that reality to inform their seeing. He looked down the roads again, and this time he was looking differently, not with the confusion of someone who cannot see, but with the clarity of someone who is beginning to see what was already there, who is allowing the illumination to work, rather than trying to generate their own light by the force of anxious thinking. He chose. He walked down the western road with a particular quality of movement that came after a threshold crossing was made. Not the movement of someone who knew for certain they had made the right choice, but the movement of someone who had seen their situation clearly enough to make a choice, and was now committed to the seeing rather than the certainty, walking forward with open eyes rather than with the false confidence of someone who had convinced themselves that one road was certainly better than the other. Hecate watched him go. She watched him until the morning road took him, and he was small in the distance, and then gone. And she stood at the empty crossroads with her torches and her dogs, and the morning light falling on the three roads equally, as it always fell, as it would always fall. The dogs moved around her in their patient orbits. The torches burned with their steady light, and somewhere below, in the cold gray quiet of the underworld, the pale flowers bloomed in the courtyard stones, and the threshold between the worlds held its quality of membrane rather than wall, and the seasonal crossing that was now woven into the pattern of the year continued its faithful rhythm, and the living and the dead existed in their separate kingdoms, connected by the annual passage of the one who crossed between them and the torch-bearer who lit the way. She breathed the autumn air of the surface world in. It tasted of fallen leaves and cold earth and the particular compound smell of the field edges in the autumn. When the threshold plants had finished their growing and were beginning the crossing into their winter state, the state of holding what they had produced in their roots and their seeds against the return of the season that would call it back up. She breathed it out. The crossroads was quiet. The three roads stretched away in their three directions into the morning world, and the goddess of the threshold stood at the center of the meeting of ways with her torches and her dogs and her three faces, and the full weight of everything she was, attending to the crossing that was always happening, the threshold that was always present, the between that was always, always there. The crossroads was quiet in the autumn morning, and the three roads stretched away into the world, and the torches burned with their steady ancient light, and the dogs moved in their patient orbits around the meeting of ways. And Hecate stood at the center of everything that met, and everything that diverged, and felt the full quality of what she was, and had always been and would always be. The night was coming. Not this particular night, not the specific darkness that would follow this specific autumn morning in its ordinary way. The night was always coming in the sense that it had always been coming, had been on its way since the first morning of the world, had been present as the future faces constant and patient knowledge that the day would end and the night would return and the threshold between them would be crossed again, as it was always crossed, as it would always be crossed, world without end. She began to walk, not toward any destination. She had never walked toward destinations in the way that mortal travelers walk toward them, with the forward lean of someone whose whole attention was organized around the point of arrival. She walked because walking was her nature, because the threshold keeper could not be still in the way that Hades was still in his palace, or Kronos was still in his deep coiling around the world. Her stillness was in the walking itself, the particular quality of movement that was so completely and consistently itself that it achieved the quality of rest from the inside, the rest of a thing that had found the form of motion that perfectly expressed what it was, and was therefore never in conflict with itself, never pulling against its own direction. The world moved around her as she walked. The autumn world, bare and cold and honest in its stripped quality, offered itself to her triple sight without the obscuring richness of summer's fullness. The structure of things was visible now, the skeleton of the landscape, the bones of the trees, the clean lines of the field edges where the boundary between cultivated and uncultivated was most clearly drawn. She walked the field edges and felt the threshold plants in their winter state, their above-ground parts withdrawn into the cold air, their true work happening below, in the roots, in the seeds, in the patient biochemical processes that the cold did not stop but transformed into a different mode, the mode of holding rather than expressing. She understood holding. She had always understood it. The threshold was a form of holding, the holding of the space between two states, the maintenance of the between against the pressure of both sides to collapse it into one of themselves, to resolve the threshold into either or rather than allowing it to remain the richer and more difficult both and. She held the between the way the threshold plants held their chemistry in winter, not passively, not simply by being there, but with the active and patient maintenance of something that required constant attention to remain what it was. She walked toward the oldest crossroads. She felt it before she saw it, as she always felt it, as a deepening quality in the ground beneath her feet, the accumulated weight of all the attentions it had ever received, pressing upward through the stone with a particular warmth of something that had been cared for across a very long time. This crossroads was older than most things in the landscape around it, older than the civilization that had laid the roads down in their current form, over the paths that earlier feet had worn into the ground, over the paths that animals had made, over the paths that water had made before any feet had found them. The crossroads was older than the roads. This was what she felt in it, that the meeting of ways was more fundamental than any specific road, that the principle of convergence and divergence, the place where paths came together before separating again, was not created by the laying of roads but was found by it, was a quality of the landscape that preceded human travel, and would remain after the roads had been reclaimed by the ground. The crossroads was where it was because something in the shape of the land made it inevitable. A slight rise, a change in the quality of the soil, a place where the natural roots of movement through the landscape coincided because the landscape itself directed movement there. She arrived at it as the light was beginning its afternoon decline. The sky was clear in the way of autumn skies, that particular clarity that was not the thick warmth of summer clarity, but the thin transparency of cold air, the clarity of a medium that had been stripped of its moisture and its warmth, and was in its stripped state most completely itself, most purely what it was, not obscuring anything, not adding any quality of its own to what moved through it, simply and perfectly transparent. She stood at the center. The three roads stretched away from her feet in their three directions, and she felt the full quality of what the crossroads was, the convergence point of all the movements that had ever come through it, the sum of all the travelers who had stood here, and all the choices that had been made here, and all the offerings left here in the dark, and all the kneeling in the cold, and all the quiet asking that had ever been directed toward the threshold rather than away from it. She was full of it, not in the way of being burdened or weighted down, full in the way of being completely inhabited, completely present, all the available space in what she was occupied by what she was, not by the accumulated history of the crossroads, which was outside her and around her and beneath her rather than inside her, but by the quality of her own existence moving through that history, her own nature finding in the accumulated attention of the crossroads its most complete and resonant expression. She raised her torches. They caught the afternoon light in the particular way of flames that were burning in daylight, not invisible, not obscured by the sun, but different, their quality changed by the presence of the other light, in the same way that a voice changes quality when it is heard against a background of other sound. She raised them, and they burned with the quality that was always hers, the threshold illumination that was most fully itself in the dark, but was present even now, even in the clear, cold transparency of the autumn afternoon. The dogs settled around her feet. They settled in the way of animals that have arrived somewhere, and recognized it as the right place, with the complete relaxation of creatures that had been moving and were now still, and were at ease in the stillness, in the same way they were at ease in the moving, because their ease was not dependent on either state, but was the quality of a nature that was entirely itself, in whatever condition it found itself. They lay on the cold stone of the crossroads center, and they were warm, and they breathed, and they were entirely there. She looked down the three roads. She looked with all three faces, the past face and the present face and the future face, each attending to its road in the way it attended to its direction of time. The road behind, the road from which she had come, the road of the past, was the road of all the long ages of her existence, all the crossroads and field edges and dark moon nights and the working at thresholds, the accompaniment of Persephone and the conversations with Circe, and the long-sustained relationship with the herb-gatherers and the midwives and the death attendants and the travelers who had knelt in the dark and not known which way to go. The past face held it all, not as a weight, not as the burden of accumulated time that long existence sometimes became for beings whose nature was not made for the long view. She held it with the quality of the river holding its course, not carrying it as something separate from itself, but simply being it, the past as the substance of what she was, rather than as something she was obliged to carry. She looked down the road of the future. The future face saw what it always saw, not with the detail of prophecy, not as a sequence of specific events waiting to unfold, but as the quality of what was coming, the broad shape of the time ahead, the character of the threshold that the future was. She saw the world continuing its faithful turning. She saw the seasons crossing their boundaries as they had always crossed them. She saw the crossroads remaining at the meeting of ways through all the changes in the roads that led to it and from it. She saw the threshold plants growing at the field edges through all the changes in the fields they bordered. She saw herself still here, not in any specific form, not with any guarantee of the details of what here would mean across all the long ages still ahead, but present, still walking the edges, still carrying the torches, still standing at the crossing of ways with her three faces turned in their three directions, and the dogs around her feet, and the particular quality of threshold illumination moving through the dark and the light with the same steady consistency it had always had. The present face looked down the road of the present. The road of the present was the road she was on, not behind her and not ahead of her, but beneath her feet, the exact point where the past road and the two possible future roads met and were for one moment the same road, the same ground, the same point of being that was neither what had been nor what would be, but the living and breathing and burning fact of what was. The crossroads was here. She was here. That was the whole of it, not a small thing. The whole of everything that she was, and everything that the crossroads was, and everything that the threshold was, and everything that the between was. All of it present in the simple and complete fact of standing at the center of the meeting of ways on an autumn afternoon, with the torches burning and the dogs warm at her feet, and the three roads stretching away in their three directions, and the world turning in its faithful and eternal way around the point where she stood. The afternoon moved toward evening. She felt the threshold of it coming, the crossing between the day and the dark, the border between the world's lit face and its night face, the moment of the in-between that was neither afternoon nor evening but the exact edge between them. She attended to it with the full quality of her presence, letting it arrive at its own pace, not hurrying it and not holding it back, simply being present to the crossing the way she was present to all crossings. The light changed, not suddenly. Nothing she attended to ever changed suddenly, because sudden change was the experience of beings who were not attending to the approach of the change, who were caught unaware by what had been coming for a long time but had not been noticed. She had been attending to this approach since the morning. The slow declension of the sun's angle, the gradual shift in the quality of the light from the high clear warmth of noon through the amber quality of the afternoon to this, the first intimation of the evening, the light taking on the quality of a threshold. The torches changed with it. They brightened as the evening light dimmed, not by any increase in the intensity of their burning, but by the simple consequence of their background changing, the other light around them reducing, the context of their quality shifting until they were more visible, more fully themselves, the threshold illumination they had always been now more apparent because the ambient light of the surface world was withdrawing toward its nightly rest. She felt the dogs stir. They felt the coming night in the way animals feel the approach of the conditions they are made for, with the particular readiness of creatures whose element is returning, their bodies adjusting to the quality of the darkening air, their senses sharpening in the way senses sharpen when the condition they are calibrated for is arriving. They rose from the cold stone of the crossroads center, and they moved around her in the wider pattern of their active orbits, nosing at the ground at the edges of the roads, reading whatever the ground had to offer in the way of the night's arriving information. She breathed the evening air in. It was colder than the afternoon air, carrying in its temperature the first quality of the night, not the full cold of the deep dark hours, but the anticipatory cold of the transition, the cold that was the threshold between day's warmth and night's full chill. It tasted of the crossroads stone and the threshold plants at the road edges, and something else that was harder to name, the compound quality of the between itself, the air of the threshold hours that she had breathed since the beginning of her existence, and that she could no more separate from the experience of being herself than the sound of the sea can be separated from the experience of standing at the shore. She breathed it out. The night came. It came in the way it had always come, in the way it would always come, gradually, without announcement. The world not noticing the exact moment of its arrival, noticing only that at some point between the fading of the last light and the full dark it was here, completely and without remainder, the sky above the crossroads darkening through the gradations of the threshold between day and night, and arriving at last at the full quality of the dark. The stars appeared, one by one, in the way they always appeared on a clear night, the brightest ones first, coming through the thinning blue of the last light with the confidence of things that had been there all along and were only now visible, and then the dimmer ones, and then the dimmest, filling the sky in order of their brightness, until the full field of them was present above the crossroads, each one its own source of light, the whole of them together, making the darkness luminous in the way of her mother Asteria's nature, the falling star quality of her inheritance present in every point of light above her. The dark moon was coming, not tonight. The moon in its current phase was a thin crescent that would set not long after the sun, leaving the sky fully dark before the night was deep. But the dark moon was days away, was the future face's near knowledge, was approaching in its monthly way with the patient certainty of the most reliable threshold in the world's sky. She felt it coming the way she always felt it coming, as a quality of anticipation that was not impatient, the attentive waiting of a being for the condition that most fully expressed what it was. She stood at the crossroads in the full dark. Her torches burned with their full quality now, the threshold illumination most completely itself in the condition it was made for, the light that was not the sun's light and not the moon's light, but the between light, the light of the threshold between the living world and the world of the dead, the light that had been burning at the meeting of ways since before the first road was laid and the first traveler stood at the crossing and did not know which way to go. She raised them higher, not as a gesture toward anything specific, not as the signal of an arrival or a departure, simply as the full expression of what she was, the complete and honest embodiment of the threshold keeper at her threshold, the torchbearer bearing her torches at the place that had always been hers, in the way that the sea was Poseidon's, and the sky was Zeus's, and the deep dark was Hades's, not through claim or force or the formal settlement of a divine dispute, but through the absolute correspondence of a nature and the place that expressed it most completely. The three roads stretched away from her feet into the dark. The past road moved away behind her, into the long distance of everything that had been. All the crossroads and all the dark moon nights, and all the threshold attendings of all the long ages, all the edge plants and all the threshold crossings and all the kneeling in the dark, and all the quiet, honest asking that had ever been directed toward the between rather than toward either of its sides. The two future roads moved away ahead of her into the dark of everything that would be. The seasons still turning, the crossroads still receiving their travelers, the threshold plants still growing at the field edges, the dark moon still arriving in its monthly way, the boundary between the worlds still needing its torchbearer, the between still needing its keeper. She stood between them. This was what she had always been, not the past and not the future, but the exact and living present of the threshold. The being who stood at the meeting of ways, and held the light, and let the travelers see, and let the crossings be made, and move through the world without belonging to any part of it completely, without being entirely of the day or entirely of the night, without being entirely of the living world or entirely of the world of the dead, without being entirely of any single time or any single place. The between, always the between. It was not a deprivation. It had never been a deprivation. Not from the first moment she had stood at the meeting of ways in the young world and felt the crossroads recognize her and known that this was what she was and where she was, and that the being what she was in the place she was not less than belonging somewhere fully, but was different, was the wholeness of the threshold rather than the wholeness of the center, the wholeness of the being who moved between all centers and belonged to none of them, and was therefore in the deepest sense free. She was free. Free in the way that the edge is free from the constraints of either of the things it edges. Free in the way that the night is free from the demands of the day's purpose. Free in the way that the between places are free from the rules that govern the places on either side of them. Not free from everything. She had her work, her faithful and ancient work of standing at the crossroads and holding the torches and attending to the threshold between the worlds. But free within her work, free in the doing of it, free in the being what she was in the place she was made for. The dogs moved ahead of her into the night. She felt them go, felt their warm animal presence moving ahead through the dark, covering the ground between her and wherever the night would take them, their noses reading the threshold air, their paws quiet on the cold ground of the roads. They moved with the easy confidence of things in their element, and their element was this: the night world and the field edges and the crossroads and the dark moon and the between, the same element that was hers, the same quality of existence that she had shaped them toward, and that had shaped them, across all the long ages of running ahead of her through the dark, into the most complete expression of what a being of the threshold could be in animal form. She followed. She walked out of the center of the crossroads and onto one of the roads, not choosing it as a destination, not committing to it as a path that excluded the others, but stepping onto it as the threshold between staying and going, as the road that was most fully the road in the moment of being walked rather than in the moment of being stood at. She walked into the night. The night received her in the way it always received her, completely, without ceremony, as simply the continuation of a relationship that had been continuous since the beginning of her existence, and would be continuous until the world found its end, if it found an end, which was a question she did not ask, because the right face showed her only the quality of the future, and the quality of the future, as far as she could feel, it was simply this: the continuation of what was the same night and the same crossroads and the same torches and the same dogs and the same walking at the edges of things that had always been. The night deepened around her, not the dark moon night, not yet. There was still the thin crescent of the moon somewhere at the edge of the sky, already below the horizon, already set, its absence beginning to produce the fuller dark of its approach to the new phase. She moved through the deepening dark with her torches, and felt the night world doing what it did when she was in it, becoming more fully itself, the edge things more present, the threshold plants more vivid in whatever quality of sense she attended to them with, the field boundaries and the forest edges and the road margins more alive with the particular life of things that organized themselves around the between. She gathered as she walked. The harvest was small in the autumn, not the rich gathering of the summer's edge, not the abundance of the growing season. But the autumn harvest had a quality the summer harvest did not have. The quality of things that had completed their growing and were now in their most concentrated form, their chemistry distilled by the season's end into something that was smaller in quantity and greater in potency, the essential quality of what they were reduced to its most fundamental expression. She held what she gathered. She walked through the night, and she held the harvest, and her torches burned, and her dogs ran ahead, and the world moved around her in its faithful turning, and somewhere below the surface the pale flowers in the underworld courtyard bloomed in their cold way, and the rivers moved and the dead rested, and the seasonal boundary between the worlds held its quality of membrane rather than wall. And somewhere on the surface, in a village or a city or a settlement at the edge of the world that the old roads led to, someone was lying down to sleep. They lay in the dark of their ordinary night, and the dark was the dark of their room. Their shelter, the enclosed space of a life organized around the center of things, around hearth and family and the ordinary reassurances of the known world. They lay in the dark and felt the particular quality of the threshold between waking and sleeping, the most intimate threshold of all, the one that every living person crossed twice a day without thought, without ceremony, without the quality of attention that the crossing deserved. She felt it. She felt it the way she felt all crossings, with the complete and unhurried attention of a being whose entire existence was organized around the threshold, who could not be indifferent to a crossing of any kind, no matter how small, no matter how ordinary, no matter how unlike the great seasonal crossings of the world it appeared to be. The crossing into sleep was not a small thing. It was the nightly practice of the threshold, the body's daily descent into the state that was most like the deep dark, most like the quality of the between, most like the condition of the crossroads at midnight on the dark of the moon. In sleep, the ordinary rules of the waking world relaxed their grip. The past and the future pressed less urgently against the present. The boundary between what was known and what was unknown became more permeable. The edges of things were more accessible, the threshold nature of all things more visible to the dreaming mind than it was to the waking one. She turned one of her torches toward the sleeping, not to illuminate them. They were in their sleep, and the light they needed was the interior light of their own dreaming. She turned her torch toward the threshold they were crossing, the boundary between waking and sleeping, and she held her light there in the way she held it at all thresholds, without demanding anything, without directing anyone, simply making visible what was there, simply being present at the crossing with the quality of attention that the crossing deserved. The threshold between waking and sleeping was hers as much as any other. She had always been present at it, every night, in every place in the world where someone lay down and crossed into sleep. She was present at the threshold in the way she was present everywhere at once, not by being physically at each individual crossing, but by being the quality of the threshold itself, the between made present as a felt quality of the space at the exact boundary between one state and another. She was the feeling of the edge of sleep, the particular quality of awareness that existed in the last moments before the crossing into sleep, the slight loosening of the ordinary mind's grip on the ordinary world, the slight increase in the permeability of the boundary between the known and the unknown, the slight sense of standing at an edge and feeling the quality of what was on the other side. That was her. That quality of the threshold had always been her presence in the most intimate crossing of every mortal night. She stood at the crossroads in the deep of the dark. The torches burned at the meeting of ways with the full quality of the threshold illumination. The light that was neither the sun's light nor the moon's light, but the between light, the light that had been burning since before the first road and would be burning after the last one. The light that illuminated without deciding and made visible without demanding, and held the threshold open by being present to it, with the full and honest quality of a being who had found in the between, not a condition to be escaped, but the most complete and honest expression of what it was to exist at the edge of everything. The dogs were somewhere ahead in the dark, their howling carrying back across the cold night air in the sound that was hers, the sound of the approach of the threshold keeper, the announcement to the night world that she was moving through it, the long and patient and ancient sound of the between being attended to. She breathed the night in, all three faces receiving the cold air, the past face knowing all the night she had breathed, and the future face knowing all the night she would breathe, and the present face simply breathing, fully and without remainder, in this exact night, at this exact crossroads, in this exact between, out. The breath moved through the crossroads and along the three roads and into the dark world beyond the meeting of ways, and it carried in it the quality of everything she was. The threshold and the torchlight and the triple sight and the edge plants and the dark moon and the dogs howling in the far night, and the pale flowers in the underworld courtyard, and the field edges, and the old women at the herb margins, and the midwives at the threshold of birth, and the death attendants at the threshold of death, and all the travelers who had ever stood at the crossroads and not known which way to go, and all the ones who would stand there still. She was all of it. She was the between of all of it. She was the torch at the edge of every darkness, the light at the meeting of every way, the presence at every threshold that had ever needed a keeper, and every threshold that would ever need one, steady and ancient and entirely herself, the goddess of the crossroads at her crossroads, burning and burning and burning in the dark. You are at the threshold. You have always been here before, every night of your life. You know this crossing. You have made it 10,000 times, and you will make it again. And each time it is new, and each time it is the same crossing, and each time the threshold holds between the waking world and the sleeping one, steady and patient and attended to. The torches burn at the meeting of ways. The dogs are somewhere in the dark. The three roads stretch away into everything that has been, and everything that is, and everything that will be. And at the center of the crossing, at the exact and living point where all the roads meet, the torch-bearer stands with her light raised and her three faces turned in their three directions, and the cold night moving around her in its ancient way. Let the crossing take you. The threshold holds. The torches burn. The between is here as it has always been here, as it will always be here. Steady and warm and lit, the oldest and most faithful light in the world, burning at the place where all paths meet, in the dark that is not empty but full, in the night that is not an ending but a door.